Başlamadan önce ben de Türkçe birkaç bir şey söylemek istiyorum. Ben işin saha tarafıyım. ICI ile aslında bu işbirliklerimizin ikinci bir ayağı diyebilirim. Aslında 2 sene önceden de, yani 2011'de ICI ile Türkiye'den küratörlerin onların oluşturduğu bir takım kısa eğitim programlarına Türkiye'den küratörlerin katılması için bir işbirliği yapmıştık. Her sene 4 tane küratöre bu programlara katılmaları için bir nevi burs veriyoruz diyebilirim. Bunlar 10 gün sıkıştırılmış eğitim programları. Küratörler arasında işte networkleri geliştirmek için, aynı zamanda da belli konularla ilgili araştırmalar yapmak üzere dünyanın çeşitli yerlerinde oluyor. Bu ise aslında işbirliğimizin ikinci bir ayağı. ICI'de bu programlardan birine neden İstanbul'da yapmayalım fikriyle ortaya çıkmıştır. Onlar için de bizim için de ilk. Biz aslında işin organizasyon tarafını, programlama tarafını yürütmüyoruz. Diğer projelerimizde de olduğu gibi. Fakat destek veriyoruz burada olmasına. Bu programda online olarak başladı. Bunun farklı olan tarafı bu. Diğerlerinde 10 gün boyunca belirli bir şehirde veya bölgede araştırmalar ve konuşmalar oluyordu. Bu programda online başladı ve son birkaç günü hem Türkiye'den bir takım insanların konuşmalarıyla hem de yurt dışından katılımcılarla yürütüldü. Bu da katılımcıların araştırmalarını aslında sunacakları son etabı diyebiliriz. Bizim için önemli olan bir sonraki noktada yine bu burslara devam ediyoruz ve geliştirmek, yani daha fazla insanın gitmesini sağlamak, farklı bölgelerden, farklı bölgelerden insanların programlara gitmesini sağlamak sürecinin bu kadar. İyi seyirler.
Really apologize because that is as much Turkish as I know. But I want to welcome every one of you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ayrıntılı. I'm Associate Director of Public Programs and Research at ICI. And today what we're going to do is have the presentations of 6 out of the 7 participants of this curatorial seminar. I understood online. So I think that Marva explained how this program was structured. This is a collaboration between ICI and SAHA, and I really want to thank Marva and Yavuz for all the support in developing this program with us and trusting ICI to develop this program that is the first program that has an online component, and that's slightly different to the other curatorial intensives that we have done. So the 6 out of the 7 participants that were able to join us in Istanbul have been working with ICI for 4 months, and basically through online sessions with different speakers to think about emerging art scenes and to think about different models of curating, in particular the model of the biennial. And we have been in Istanbul for about a week, a little bit less than a week, meeting with a number of people, including curators, the curators of the 13th Istanbul Biennial, Fulya Ardenci, and also Andrew Phillips and Abudu Musalu, visiting the Biennial, and also meeting with a number of artist initiatives, commercial galleries, non-profit spaces, and institutions. So it's been really an extraordinary experience for ICI and for the group to be able to be here and engage in conversations and start understanding the complexities of this amazing place. So we're really happy to be here. What the participants are going to be doing is present, each of them joined the program with the research topic they wanted to develop. And what you guys are going to be hearing today is basically caught in that process. It's not the final product, because the idea is that after this week here, they go back to their different places, Brazil, Italy, / Greece, and other places where they are based and they work to continue developing the research. And I think this is a very special forum for them because instead of presenting the final result, this is really a moment to continue the conversation and really actually pose some of the questions that they have been developing and thinking about, with the hope that you will be generous enough and provide some feedback and provide some more questions also for them to continue thinking and to continue writing. We hope that in about 2 months, they will have a written paper that then will be published in the website of ICI. I really want to thank Salt for welcoming us this afternoon. We had the privilege of meeting also with Vasif and Kickstart this week. So I want to thank Vasif and Denise for opening the doors of Salt for today. We're going to do this in 2 panels. The first one is going to be 3 people, and I'm going to tell you the order in which they will be presenting. Nasli Gurlek, who is an independent curator based in Istanbul, followed by Monica Sinel, who is a Colombian curator living and working in Sao Paulo, and Ozzy Arsoy, who also works as an independent curator but also at collector's space here in Istanbul. They will be the first panel. After each of them present, I will ask them some questions to try to trigger a conversation, and very soon I would love if you can join us in the conversation and start the dialogue with that. After that, the second panel will be Claire Shi, Kate Martin, and Anna Santomauro, and it will be moderated by one of our guest speakers of this week, George Fremder, who joined us from South Africa. I will also add very quickly that we also had Sally Talent and Bernard Raj that joined us also this week. So thank you very much for this.
Hi, I'm Nazlı. In this presentation today, I will attempt to analyze the role of the public-private dichotomy in the institution of the exhibition in Turkey in the specific context of Maçka Sanat Galerisi. In what can be seen as an attempt of reconstructing a reverse evolution of a particular public-private hybrid form that is very specific to the history of this gallery, the essay will question ideas around the specific form of display and exhibition apparatus that is about invisibility as much as visibility. Finally, it will attempt to explore the possible roots of the specific exhibition apparatus in the pain-free attitudes of Osman Hamdi. Maçka Sanat Galerisi is a privately funded and semi-commercial gallery in Istanbul that was founded in 1967 by 2 collectors, Rabia Çapa and Varlık Yalman, with the aim of providing space and support to the new tendencies in the art of their time. Over the course of 35 years, the gallery has presented 145 solo and 30 group shows and has amassed an extensive archive of documents, both visual and written, on contemporary art. It has been an intellectual hub, critically challenging the dominant artistic scene in Istanbul and giving shape to the local contemporary art production as we know it today. A community of artists formed in and around it and grew over the years, largely by way of artists selecting other artists to exhibit. These included Sarkis, Ayşe Erkmen, Füsun Onur, Gülsün Kara Mustafa, Serhat Kiraz, Daniel Bürem, François Mollet, Ömer Uluç, Adnan Çoker, Sabri Berker, Freya Koral, Altan Gürman, Adnan Çoker, among many others. Exhibitions that took place here from the mid-1980s on and throughout the 1990s typically took on to negotiate the imposing aspects of the gallery's design. As you can see, this flat and monochromatic shelter, the symmetrical grid of pure geometric form, is anything but neutral. The absolute reality that it conveys appears to be detached from all references to the outside world, and it could have been almost an architectural reproduction of Mondrian. Over the years, the space has been confirmed as an institution in itself, which bound and framed artistic exploration in its demand to be conserved and conformed. It set the stage for countless countless escapes from modernism, where practices that are historically categorized as post-minimalism, conceptual art, and institutional critique were produced and displayed for the first time before the public in Turkey. These are images from the shows, the solo shows that took place in the gallery throughout the 90s. A solo show by artist Izostat, which I curated last year at the gallery, was titled "Is I'm Not Dealing with Triangle, Square and Circle," and it was the final one in a series of solo shows that began in September 2011 and ended in June 2012, in which Machka decided to celebrate its 35th year anniversary by showing works made for the gallery by a group of conceptually oriented young generation of artists from Turkey. Titled Bengü Burak Volkan Alp Elmas Is, after the first names of the 6 artists, the shows underlined the different areas of interest, themes and methods of the artists, as well as pondering on the myth of the artist that the international art apparatus consistently nurtures. I'm Not Dealing with Triangle, Square and Circle was the result of the time Ilse spent among the recordings and documents from the archives of the gallery in the past year. The show tackled questions relating to tradition, history and cultural heritage in the production and display of art, and in particular, it raised the issue of the artist's public address in relation to the local history and context. A series of objects and sound pieces referencing or incorporating material from the gallery's archives was brought together under such a premise. The 4 main pieces in the show were composed of 4 objects, some found and others were made, and they embodied 4 basic geometric forms with references to artworks from the gallery's long history of exhibitions. These objects were a steel hula hoop, a cone dome, a triangular prism, and the gross feature of the gallery, the square-shaped ceramic tiles taken by Is as a given for her installation. During the opening night, a performance took place. A woman in a military-style khaki jumpsuit wandered through the crowd, staging a minimalist choreography of stylized actions, using the objects as props to measure the interiors. Following the opening night, the objects were precariously placed through the labyrinthine spaces of the gallery and left to the visitors' disposition for the duration of the show, whereas a silent video was projected on one of the gallery's tile-covered walls. This showed the same performer, this time partially visible in a black cat suit, busy carrying out the same kind of stylized exercises like a ghostly presence haunting the gallery space. The gallery was turned into a training field and a playground at once, activating the gallery crowd into what I like to call a controlled vitality. The intention was clear. The audience was to be seduced by the pure material functionality of the art objects on display, as well as to be aroused by an ambiguous composition of human voice brought in by 2 sound pieces, filling in the womb-like volume of the gallery from 2 distinct sources. These were collaged by Is with extracts from the taped artist conversations from the archives, selected on the basis of a shared concern with the recording of the spoken word. The 2 of them played together revealed a striking history of declamations, interrogations and justifications before the public, constantly checking out whether their voices were being recorded. A sensor was placed at the front door and it activated the player in the front room each time someone walked in. Voices from the past were orchestrated into a composition of chants which welcomed the newcomer, informed those present of her arrival, and bid her goodbye on the way out. Is's articulation of the historical material is actually closer to a concept of translation than that of appropriation. The title, I'm Not Dealing with Triangle, Square and Circle, a kind of no-manifesto, was a quotation from Adnan Çoker, delivering an artist talk in the 1980s, translated by Is into a whole new artistic context. Çoker was arguing for the potential of geometric forms as a universal language and their rootedness in local heritage. His take on abstraction was a form of design away from the painterly context of Çoker's modernism, and it did not include the surplus Çoker was keen on introducing at a taped conversation along with this exhibition, the rhetoric. Çoker's statement, reaching us through its transcription, is suggestive of a twofold feeling that is both intimate and public. It represents the private hope of an intellectual looking for understanding in the future, as well as a public idiom typical of Turkish modernism. Adnan Çoker was educated as a painter at the Academy of Fine Arts in Istanbul in the late 1940s, and then went to Paris on a scholarship from the Turkish state at the time. On his return, he was to educate his peers and students with the Western master's style he had learned in Paris. At Machka, his reliance on the device's mediation to form an audience signals the a priori acceptance of the public's absence in the actual moment, as well as a disbelief in the potential of the exhibition to form a public by default. By recasting geometric forms as objects in 3 dimensions and repurposing them as tools through which to relate to the specific environment, which enclosed a significant history of avant-gardism, tradition and heritage in modern Turkey, including Çoker's teaching, is meant to activate and classify that event to understand it with the perspective of today. The archive that became the type of documentation that allowed for memory to be created within the present, and the exhibition turned into pure gesture. It allowed both witnessing and display. The kind of gesture exercised by is can be seen close to one that is brought up by a 1990 gallery exhibition titled References. References problematized the institution of the exhibition as a form of public address in relation to the larger art historical context. The show featured Serhat Kiraz, Ayşe Erkmen, Füsun Onur, and Canan Beykal, all concerned with the newly emerging ideas surrounding the formal and political potentialities of installation art. They became together in 1990 to revise their individual practices in relation to one another's in the form of an exhibition. The result was a compilation of reproductions or smaller parts of 10 works by each of them, made to fit the 40 per 40 centimeter base of a plinth. Pieces that had not been recognized as part of the official Turkish art history until that moment, but nevertheless made part of an artist's personal history, were made available to the public eye, thus resting upon the institution of the exhibition for recognition. What I find particularly interesting here is the fact that the artists were to act as both witnesses of each other's production and producers of a historical category, in what was to be recognized as an innovative exhibition model. I would argue that this model owed a good deal of its emergence to a specific understanding of the public, which came to characterize the social interactions of Machka's community of artists. The photographs from the archives demonstrate the social world of the gallery and the interactions among the gallery's regular community. And what appears to be the opening events or talks programs, cheerful faces appear against the grid of the ceramic background, faces that become all the more familiar over the years. The sense of conformity and warmth that is often only found in the privacy of a domestic environment is felt even through the documentation. A second and perhaps more interesting aspect that I've come to notice is that the poses are all cheerfully and insistently staged for the camera. Similarly, in any photograph documenting a talk or discussion, a tape recorder transcribing the event occupies the center stage. The presence of these visual and audio recording devices make evident for me these people's high levels of consciousness, and whether they are the sign of the absence of a public or high publicity instead matters very little today. What is more significant instead is that the private feeling of this particular gallery environment seems to have provided them shelter and comfort, where they could fully enjoy each other's company, but also and all the more pleasing witnessing their own joy. The fixation with the recording devices is suggestive of a second, more implicit desire, their aspiration to a different kind of publicness. As Michael Warner formulates it in his Counter and Counter Publics, questioning the effects of psychological states in the formation of publics. In light of Werner's thought in relation to the secret desires behind the idea of publicity, I would say that the combination of the private and public feelings behind such documentation is suggestive of these people's connection to several publics at once. They were recording and posing both for themselves and an imaginary public to come outside the walls of the gallery. The conceptual ties of the public-private dichotomy put into practice is certainly nothing new. In Turkish history, the examples can be traced back as early as Osman Hamdi. Osman Hamdi was a painter, archaeologist, educator, and museum director, educated in Paris in the 1860s, first in law and then in painting. He took part in the 1866 and 1868 Salon exhibitions in Paris as Gustave Boulanger's student. On his return to Istanbul, he was appointed to various bureaucratic positions in cultural affairs, including the Commissioner of the Ottoman Empire's participation in the Vienna exhibition in 1873, among others. He was later to found the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul as we have it today, building up on the 1869 Musée Humayun, meaning the Imperial Museum, where Byzantine antiquities were displayed. Osman Hamdi took the position of what we can today name as curator, and he remained as such for 29 years until his death in 1910. He is renowned for having introduced modern museology and preservation, and in particular for having taken legal measures against the historic artifacts from being smuggled abroad. The 19th century was a time when the declining Ottoman Empire decided to become integrated with the Western economic and cultural world as a solution to its financial and political deterioration. There came a period of modernization and innovation set on by the public announcement of the Sultan Mahmud II's cultural reforms in the public garden of Gülhane, which was then made part of the Topkapı Palace, the Sultan's main residence. When the Ottomans had to adapt, the cultural differences with the West became a serious issue. Among them was the question of publicness. Until then, public life was simultaneously private and public was the sphere related to the people, to the nation, but particularly to the state and the central government. And the state and the central government were to meet in the Sultan's name. Osman Hamdi must have felt the paradox and might have decided to deal with it in what was a rather supplementary activity for him, his painting. His painting was recognized within the genre of Orientalism. That is, style changed frequently within the norms of that genre, producing works for the market differing considerably from those he made for his private pleasure in terms of color, stroke and composition, has been a frequent debate among critics. İpek Aksürdüben defined Osman Hamdi's controversial painterly attitudes in terms of a reformed Orientalism, and Vasıf Kortun as intellectual schizophrenia. I would add that his gesture was strategic, conscious, and artful. He experimented with different styles as different ways of addressing his public. It was an unending process of redefinition, which enabled him to revise the conditions that brought them together with the others as both the public and the producer. The public-private dichotomy put into practice, that situation of mutual witnessing and display, exercised by the community of artists around Maçka, can be traced as back into the roots of the modern art history in Turkey. What appears to be an innovative exhibition model today is nothing but the performance of this tradition. The questioning of the limits of public address through this dichotomy within the historical context triggers research into what is certainly a whole new area of art historical study, the history of exhibitions in Turkey. Thank you.
So welcome everybody. I am going to be speaking about research that I have been conducting in Sao Paulo for the last 3 months. And it is based on the fact that I arrived there about 1.5 years ago from New York, where I was living before. And I noticed that Sao Paulo has a great and diverse art scene, but there was still a lot to develop. And when I arrived, I found really strong institutions, but most of them were quite bureaucratic, and it didn't seem to me like there was enough room for experimentation and process-oriented works. The commercial galleries in Sao Paulo play a crucial role, and they have for the past decades, but they've brought well-known and also less established international artists, and they have really fostered the local art scene. And one of the things, though, is that artists or emerging artists in Sao Paulo who are working there inevitably have to deal with the commercial side of the art practice in a very heavy-handed way, because they seem to really sort of envelop and have a strong influence. So the flexibility of the spaces that I will present, I will be focusing on 6 different art spaces, all of them non-profit experimental spaces, have really made a difference and have had an impact on how I've perceived the Sao Paulo art world. And originally the research was going to focus on what kind of public programming should be presented in these spaces to really foster a community. But I realized quickly when I started my research that I should shift and perhaps get to know a little bit better the ecosystem of the nonprofits. So I went into a very specific study of each space, interviewing both the people who founded these spaces and then some of the artists who have worked in them. I will focus on both the funding structure, the people behind them, why they were started, how long they have been around, and the size and scale of their programming and spaces. So I just wanted to start with this quote by Arthur Danto about one's experience of art draws on one's total experience in life, because I wanted to mention that when I was in New York, I ran 2 alternative spaces, one which was called Marvelli Lab in Williamsburg, that ran from 2004 to 2005, and then I founded an emerging artist space called Gramercy Post, which happened in a post-production house for film and sound editing, where I had a series of emerging artists exhibitions. And also, one of the most memorable experiences I had in New York were in spaces like Momenta or Goliath. And then I worked in an alternative art space called Creon. I created an exhibition there. So I feel like there are spaces that are really open to perception, emotions, and exchanges, and I was really seeking that in Sao Paulo. So I will start with Atelier 397, which is the oldest space currently in Sao Paulo. They were founded in 2004 by 3 different artists, and it was really it began as a collective studio space for all 3 of them, and then they started having exhibitions, but over the years, in around 2007, 2008, they started losing steam. And basically, they were no longer interested in having their studios open to the public, and one of the artists left the collective studio space. And so 2 curators, cultural producers, took over the space, and they have created a really interesting program of both workshops, site-specific projects, performances, lectures, and they also hold an auction, what you can see on the top right, called Surprise, where basically is one of the ways that they fund their exhibitions and their programs, where they get artists to donate pieces for an auction that happens annually, and you don't know who the artist is, so basically you're buying something really based on the aesthetic pleasure that you get from the object, not because it's a commodity by a well-known artist or not. So really leaving that up to taste and the element of surprise. They also have something called Colonia de Férias, which invites younger artists, recently graduated from BFA or MFA programs in Sao Paulo, to really think about their practice in a more experimental way. And on the bottom, in the middle, that is a photograph of a performance called Indigestão, which basically means indigestion. and they have it's a collective of 3 different artists who perform with food and sound in the streets and also moving images. And they have started a brand called için, where they sell artist editions and t-shirts and different kinds of merchandise that the artists they've worked with created in order for them to be able to make some money, to be able to finance the publications, the online platform, and then some of the exchanges that they do with other spaces. Vivo is a recently opened space that was founded by an artist, and she has a team of 4 other people working with her. And she is one of the rare spaces where everybody on staff is actually paid. She has a different set of sort of funding operation mechanisms. She has the person who donates the space, which is a massive space, 3,500 square feet. No, 3,500 square meters in the middle of the downtown area in Sao Paulo, in the building that's very iconic, that was built in the 60s by Oscar Niemeyer. And this is an area of Sao Paulo that has been quickly gentrifying, and it's quite interesting to think of the history of this space because it was basically empty for 15 years, and the person who owned it was struggling to try to sell it, and now all of a sudden the space has become a very prized possession, and the downtown area is being quickly gentrified. But thankfully, Fernanda saw it before this happened, and she started this space in 2011 with a group exhibition of 28 artists who had no gallery representation. And on the top left, the Aurora piece is one of the works that was shown in the second exhibition they had, curated by Diego Matos, who's an architect, and he actually titled the show, "If I Were to Do It Again, I Would Do It All Differently." So basically acknowledging the fact that this was a massive space, that he was working with site-specific commissions and installations for the first time, many of the artists having this opportunity. And the possibility of failure and the possibility of the space never really taking off because it was the first exhibition. And then they host a lot of lectures. They do book publications, they do film screenings. They have also so much space that they actually host artists, and you can go and walk in at any moment. It's free of entry, and you can see the artists' work in progress. Casa do Povo is a space that has existed since 1953. It is in a neighborhood called Bom Retiro, which is quite close to the downtown area, and it's always been the immigrant neighborhood. So in the 40s and 50s, it was actually where all of the Jewish immigrants came escaping the Second World War. And this was a space that was started as a living monument to the people who perished during the war. And it had a very active life from like 1953 to the 1980s, and then it fell into disrepair, and basically the people who were involved with it were no longer as interested in keeping it alive. And in the last couple of years, a French curator called Benoît Serroussi has decided to take it over and revitalize the space. And there are a number of different theater groups and dance groups that are in the space. They have also collaborated with different existing institutions, like the Feria dos Livros de Tijuana, that was organized by the Galeria Vermelho. And then they also hold screenings, and they recently hosted a symposium about what the future of the space should be and how the neighborhood and the community can be integrated into the space, and how the space can be activated within that specific community, which nowadays is actually majority Korean. Then there is a space called Kunsthalle, which was opened in 2012, and in a very short span of life, they have organized a huge number of exhibitions. They have 4 different types of programming. They have concerts, and they have a film series, and then they have exhibitions by emerging Brazilian artists and also by Swiss artists. So they collaborate with Switzerland and bring in these international artists. And one of the interesting things about Kunsthalle is that they have a reading area where they get all of the international publications, and it's actually one of the few places where you can find things like Artform and Moves and the Exhibitionist. So you can just sit there, have a coffee, because she also has a tiny coffee spot, and just browse through the literature. And it's a very welcoming and experimental space run by one person, and it functions basically as an alternative economy, where basically the artists who are involved with this space agree to work side by side with her and really have it be a collaboration. Casa Tomada is one of the older spaces. They've been around for 4 years, and it was originally the house of an artist who moved to a different state in Brazil, and she left the house to two girls who have been running the space for the last 4 years. One of them recently left the team, but the other one is still involved. And they host residencies. It's an ongoing residency program. They have had 8 different editions, and they invite both international artists and local artists. They like to combine those two so that the local artists can really help the international artists get a sense of what goes on in Sao Paulo and not just have it be sort of secluded international artist residency. And they don't have living premises, but they do have the studios, and they have a very active program of people coming to see the space and visit both architects, fashion designers, curators, journalists. And the original premise was that they would have artists who are dealing with different fields. And so this exchange and dialogue with the people who come in and do talks with the artists would be conducive to new bodies of work. And it's not about the product, so they're really encouraged to basically do research and experiment while they're there. And they also have a program called a Casa Recibe, where basically artists or collectives are invited to do a piece in the vitrine, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner. And that's a way of collaborating with some of the other spaces. And then there is Casa Fósforos, which was founded by Maria Monteiro, and she was lucky to be invited by her partner, a woman who had a very interesting collection of vintage objects. And so she shares the house with Casa Juizi, which is a vintage shop. And they host exhibitions, they host lectures and public screenings, and then she also has a program of luncheons that has been very popular in gathering people in a very informal setting to talk about art and spend a few hours dealing with the exhibitions. On the top right is a permanent installation by an artist called Rodrigo Bueno. And I will end by saying that all of these spaces are doing exhibitions that really look to provide memorable life experiences. They're not interested in the commercial value, they're not interested in getting the artists to become superstars. They really want the artists to be free and give them that possibility, and as a way of creating a temporal community. One of the things that is quite problematic is that some of them, since they are run by artists, it's quite difficult to have an artistic practice and then keep these spaces alive, so the sustainability of the spaces is quite questionable. And then the funding structures in Brazil don't necessarily favor these sort of spaces where it's much more about publications and experimentation than it is about a solid exhibition or things that have an easier time getting state funding. So the questions that I would come up with is how you define what parallel and alternative models are and how they actually contribute a different element to the ecosystem of the Sao Paulo art world, and how much I heard from them that oftentimes after a number of years, these spaces have died because these are the current ones, but there have been in the past, in the 90s, other artist-run spaces that did not have the fortune of surviving, and there seems to be a thought that they're like open thinking, they're experimental, they have no specific aims other than really giving artists opportunities to play around and be more free. And then I would like to end with this quote by Walter Hobbs from the Ferris film, that art offers the possibility for love with strangers, and every single space that I spoke with seemed to have that notion in mind, and really want to create spaces for a community where the dialogue can actually take place at a longer and slower pace than they do in commercial or institutional spaces. Thank you.
Hello everyone. First of all, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Oske. And I think my research is basically somehow parallel to what Monica was talking about earlier, in terms of thinking about how artist-run spaces position themselves vis-a-vis other structures in their local art scene. My focus is going to be Istanbul, and what I'm interested in is discussing the relationship between the existing artist-run spaces and the growing number of large-scale institutions and museums in the city. Basically, indeed, the paper that I'm still working on, I depart from the interviews that I conducted with 7 artists who started their own spaces in Istanbul, and I owe them a big thank you for supporting this research. Actually, some of them are among us. I saw Didem in the back. So they are Banu Cennet of Bas, Didem Özbegan, Osman Bozkurt from PIST, Nancy Atakan from 5533, Merve Ünsal from MEST, Pınar Öğrenci from Mars, and Selda Asal from Apartman Projesi. And before I talk about these initiatives, I want to drift away from my topic for a minute or so, and basically show you a very well-known work by Fischli and Weiss, How to Work Better, from 1991. And I'm sure you all know the piece. It includes 10-point list of self-motivating instructions. Do one thing at a time, know the problem, learn to listen, learn to ask questions, distinguish sense from nonsense, accept changes inevitable, admit mistakes, say it simple, be calm, and smile. Maybe you know it. The artist basically saw these stock sentences in a pottery factory in Thailand, and then they painted them in large letters or large script, let's say, to cover the exterior of an office building in Zurich. Well, basically, the How to Work Better clearly goes back and forth between the ideas of banality and wisdom, but it also favors practice over production. And in this book called Size Matters, an exploration of the indispensability of small art spaces, writer and curator Anthony Huberman basically begins his take care with his work, and where he also equates working to behaving, and he writes, to rehearse a common truism, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. And I also want to focus that idea of behaving and, basically how doing it when I talk about these artist-run spaces. And basically I love to emphasize not what they do, not necessarily what they do, but mostly about how they do it and how they think about the conditions of working. I only have 2 slides, so I'll go back to this one. Sorry about that. So going back to Istanbul, I think I'll first try to quickly caricaturize the changing conditions for the production of art that preceded these spaces, and I'll make very big generalizations, so apologies in advance for that. So basically in Turkey, the state started retracting its support from the living artists in the 1950s, and that was the first time that we had our first galleries in Istanbul and Ankara that also functioned as art centers, let's say. By the 70s, the trust in the School of Fine Arts began to dissipate, and new support structures like Maçka Sanat Galerisi that Nazlı talked about, they emerged. And with the third coup d'etat in 1980, an abrupt change took place. State scholarship faded away totally. Basically, the market started to grow, and the private capital and the popular culture started embracing contemporary art, and independent annual exhibitions started to take place, and the biennials started. From the early 1990s onwards, the artistic subject has become a little bit more independent and perhaps more autonomous, and the question became, how do you actually empower your local situation? Since the early 2000s, the private sector has been using its resources to establish collections, archives, and large-scale institutions that favor continuity in the long run. And there have been a rising number of private museums in the first decades of the 2000s, including Ayrıntılı Museum, Sabancı Museum, Istanbul Modern Ampere Museum, which all have different types of collections ranging from calligraphy to modern and contemporary art. And I have to say that it's a quite recent phenomenon that private and corporate collections are taking the lead to establish museums dedicated to contemporary art only. Borusan Contemporary and Koç Contemporary Art Museum. Borusan opened 2 years ago, and Koç Contemporary Art Museum, I think it's set to open in 3 years. They are the most prominent example. Meanwhile, SALT, that was established 2 years ago, develops an institution basically dedicated to research and collecting archives instead of artworks. But one thing that's for sure is that there's a growing institutionalization and a rising demand for sustainability for different type of art spaces. And meanwhile, the art spaces that I mentioned here did not choose to grow physically, to raise more money or to compete for wider attention and audiences. And I think what have they done was to demand a sustained attention span. And the priority seemed to go slowly rather than anything else. And while a lot of artist-run spaces had to shut down their spaces due to lack of funds, the remaining ones stood out with their way of working or with the way of behaving, as I tried to articulate a couple of minutes ago. So clearly these initiatives have very different priorities, maybe not very different, but different priorities and different modes of self-organization, which I will have to discuss more in detail in the paper, but very briefly. Some of them are completely dependent on their founders, whereas some of them invite people to work for them. Some are dedicated to workshops, exhibitions, or residency program, whereas others focus on publishing and collecting artist books. Some receive funding from private individuals and international funders, while others rely entirely on founders' income coming from different activities. But yet, there are essential commonalities that I'd like to talk about. Clearly, they're not market-oriented. They favor self-governance. They revise the professional image of the artist by basically wearing multiple hats at a time. And perhaps more importantly, they have always hesitated to define themselves as institutions, because the word institution still connotes safe and established formats and vocabularies for art production and its mediation. But when they choose not to become institutionalized, they also choose not to adopt sustainable models for the future and also fight the risk of ongoing unnoticed or unaccounted for. So taking this observation as a starting point, what I'd like to do is to discuss a couple of ideas that we talked about in these interviews. And I have to say that my main and my first question was quite simple and very straightforward. Have your urgencies changed with the rising number of institutional structures in your city? And what kind of a relationship do you want to have with these? And again, I think I've been curious about their take on the principles of continuity and sustainability to begin with. I'd like to give an example that goes prior to these interviews in a panel discussion that was basically took place here at SALT last year as part of the CIMAM annual conference. Banu Cennetoğlu made a statement that resonated with me, and she basically said, I don't have a fear of expiration. If you run your own space, you can disappear, reinvent yourself, or choose not to invent at all. But what does it really mean to not to fear expiration as an artist space when the institutionalization of contemporary arts mandates practitioners to continuously strategize about survival and sustainability? That was my question. That basically started me to think about those questions. And it's true that such a flexibility allows artist-run spaces not to devise or execute long-term programs, as larger institutions are required to do. However, the opportunity to hibernate or to program only for the short term makes these spaces vulnerable and precarious, since they often depend on project-based funding. While the impact of sustained institutional models grows for the local art scene, the artist-run spaces seek to find a position without a methodology, which is something I really, really appreciate. In Turkey, where there are no foundations, maybe with the exception of SOHA for now, or government bodies that financially support artist-run spaces, what does rational planning for continuity means? That's also another question that we discussed. And most of these spaces choose to function on a sporadic basis, and they are very happy with that. There is no need to have a new project every month, and they can change as is needed according to the situation. And they also don't feel the pressure to measure their contribution to the local arts ecology or the local art scene, however you want to call it. And also the transition from the founders to the next generation of artists is not often desired, I should say. Many of the artists stated that they wouldn't be interested in passing on the organization to a peer, and that they would rather kill the organization, so to speak, or have it reinvent itself. But needless to say, all of them think about sustainability overall, not necessarily for financial, but mostly for energy, drive, and motivated related reasons. They seem to agree on the idea that it's really not necessary to secure funding or improve the economic conditions to continue the space, or simply put, they choose not to strategize. At this point, it's also curious to discuss how artist-run spaces relate themselves to the emerging large-scale institutions. What is their existing and desired relationship with them? Most of the artists that I talked to in the beginning, they basically said that in the beginning they were not very much interested in starting their space to oppose to another structure. Clearly, the term alternative is already a contested one, especially in a place where there are still very few secure and established structures, art structures or institutions. So the binary of alternative versus mainstream is not necessarily relevant in this context, many of them told me. And I think it's also one of the reasons why most of them stated that they started their initiatives out of personal desires and needs, without the intention of filling a gap or opposing an institutional model. And we might actually think that the relationship between these spaces and the institutions remain tangential, because most of the programming and production permeate these institutions but do not necessitate them. And at the end of the day, production remains independent and self-evaluative. However, there are concerns about visibility when it comes to big new institutions, including here SALT, I think. And some of the artists vary about the aesthetics of money. The question is, which is not a surprising one, if the concept of art, archive, and museum mesh together with the luxury culture, how does the perception of art production changes? And is there a risk of homogenizing the scene? That was a common concern, I should say. But clearly the concerns are not limited to this. For instance, Didem Özbek and Osman Bozkurt, they emphasize that the sincerity and the work ethics matter more than the luxury culture and the appearance. For them, it's much more urgent to discuss the conditions of working and conditions for production. They said that we need to discuss the hasty actions of private initiatives. We know of certain examples of institutions that close their exhibition spaces because their priorities change. Then they open a residency that they decide to shut down before the ongoing residency periods are over, and then they open a museum. And I think another recent example that happened last year with a private university museum basically selling off 2/3 of their collection at an auction here in Istanbul. It's quite telling in terms of thinking about trust and sincerity. So when it comes to collaborating, for instance, Balnıca Anatoly says, there's also a mutual act where artists create their own structures and then collaborate with different parties. If there's any hierarchical dependency between these parties, then we will end up with a bunch of always needy artists and several dysfunctional institutions. And to add to that, Merve Ünsal of Mist, she said, I do wonder why we are not paying more attention to simpler institutions that show emerging artists' works. How did the question become so large and so institutional so quickly? Didn't we skip a phase here? So at this point, I think it's also crucial to ask whether it's possible to transcend the binary of small-scale artist-run spaces versus large-scale institutions or museums. And in the last couple of months, with a lot of art practitioners and also I think everyone in the city and in Turkey in general, we keep rethinking about what we expect from art institutions. In a time when we discuss about the new forms of listening, speaking and working together, how do we relate to art institutions, which is a major question. And in the end, what makes an institution public when they don't depend on taxpayers' money? Or does an institution become public just because it gives access to its collection or archives? Or does it become public when it grants transparency or accountability, so to speak? And I would rather argue that the publicness comes from the practitioners themselves when they claim ownership of the archives and collections and actually take these institutions and museums for accountable for the decisions that they make. And Andrea Phillips, who gave a great lecture the other day, talked about the economy of gifting. And she argued that it's becoming more and more urgent to assess the role of gifting in the arts. Who gives and what conditions? And can the institutions stop being the only one who makes gifts to the public? And I think I'll go back to my initial question and I also end with another question. I have lots of questions these days. So how can artists, artist-run spaces and art professionals claim the ownership of large-scale institutions and museums and participate in institution building? And if that happens, would that dissolve the tired binaries between them? Thank you so much.
Sharing your thoughts. I know it's always a little bit harder when you're still in the middle of the process of thinking and kind of putting together all the information. So I think it's very generous of you to open up the research in this phase. And I think there is an interesting overlap in the three projects. And one of the things that is striking is this idea of thinking first of a different way of writing history, or thinking about the history of artistic practice, not maybe not only about looking at the practice of the artist itself, but also of thinking about the different ecology of the art world. And I think there's something that the three of you are thinking about, and I think I would like to hear a little bit more of why are you taking that entry point, and what you feel and think are the possible problems of doing that. I'm playing devil's advocate as much as I really enjoy the three presentations. I'm also wondering if we start writing, which I think is extremely important, don't get me wrong, but I still need to play devil's advocate. I think it's extremely important to be able to write a history of exhibition making and to get a better understanding of the history and how the different art scenes have evolved. In a way, it was interesting also that you weren't referencing the work of the artists, you were referencing more this macro perspective. And I'm wondering where, if then the artistic practice, where is it in your thinking? Where does it live? And I think maybe that's more a question addressed to Ozzy and Monica. So maybe let's start there before I ask the other questions. You have the microphone, so.
I'll do my best. Thinking about the artworks themselves, I would say that there's a difference between the different art initiatives, artist initiatives that I talked about. For instance, Dida, who's in the audience right now, in her practice, she also responds to the questions that PIS basically raises in terms of like working with the artists, collaborating with different practitioners, thinking about archives and everything. Whereas an artist like Banu Cennetoğlu, she tries to, of course her interest in artist publications reflects the way that she thinks about her space, but she tries to not to basically display or talk about her work in the space itself. And she was telling me the other day, she was basically trying to separate between two. So I don't think that there's one way of looking at that, but for instance, Didem's practice is very much involved with these ideas, and they question those ideas. Would that answer your question?
No. It does in a way. Monica, do you want to give it a shot?
I would say that for me, it's the first time I'm actually looking at exhibition history and the history of spaces within the ecology of an art scene. And what drove me to these spaces was that they're very artist-centric. So they really revolve around artistic practices, and they are the ones allowing freedom for artists to really operate at their own speed and their own desires. And then I would say that 4 of the 6 spaces are run by artists. So they are personal choices to also sort of complement their practice through these spaces. So in a way, the artist is still the center of the research.
Can you, the 3 of you, maybe talk a little bit more about this idea of the private and the public? I think Nasli took us to this very beautiful back and forth between the past and the present, and also imagining the future. And I think it was an interesting way of perceiving history as something that you write and think not so much as focusing the past, but looking forward to the present. And I think in that interesting loop, this idea of private and public also kind of evolved in a very different way. And the 2 of you also were, in your case, especially Monica's, a newcomer to the Sao Paulo scene. I think you were putting yourself as the viewer and trying to understand what these different spaces were offering. But I think I would like to hear a little bit more about this intention of, in the case of the 3 of you, of positioning yourself a little bit as the possible viewer, the viewer of something that happened in the past, and that maybe it was more of a private public, although that is kind of sounds funny, but of this, imagining this public as a public of the future, and now you're being, in a way, the public that was being addressed so many years ago before you were present. So I'm really, I want to hear a little bit more about that back and forth, and then also hear from the 2 of you about the role of the public. You said a lot of very interesting things condensed at the very end, so maybe you can talk a little bit more about this idea of co-ownership and agency that you're encouraging the public to have. And then Monica, maybe you can talk a little bit more about this personal urgency that brought you to choose this topic.
Well, I think I will start with the point on history. History, I think for all of us living and working in Turkey, history is something that is before us. It's something that we have to cope with, even in a way, but it's something we also have to learn and make sense of and create, even, because history in this place, it's been interrupted by political ruptures, it's been interrupted by coups, as Özge touched upon as well, and it's the way it's written is always very partial, and the way archives are kept are also they're either other than, there's no institution other than SALT that is really dealing with archives and trying to make them public. So our relationship with history is very much contested, I would say. And when I came back from when I came back to Istanbul 5 years ago, I was to work as a curator. The history of exhibitions was something that I had to get into and look into in order to make sense of my own practice as well. So I would say that my interest started from quite with these almost these personal reasons. Like I had to look at the history of exhibitions. And when I started to look at the history of exhibitions, it was the voice and the work of the artist that I wanted to consult at the first place, because and I wanted to hear at the first place because I think it's where we can find alternative ways of writings of history, and if there are any, actually. So, okay, I think this will be it.
I think I tried not to think about that binary to begin with. For the Turkish speakers, I think also the way that I use the word public is mostly about not kamusallaştırmak but toplumsallaştırmak. So I don't know how I can basically talk about that difference in English. Probably I will fail, so I'll just skip that part. But for me, that the idea of the co-ownership and to basically work the public, it's not necessarily coming from the general public itself, because referring to a conversation that we had the other day, I don't also necessarily think that the public has a voice, but and it's like too many, too diversified, but perhaps thinking about the arts institutions, there might be a way that the art practitioners themselves, so including artists, curators, and writers, and let's say the rest of the other arts practitioners, basically claiming certain things. So I think in my understanding, public wouldn't be something that would be graded from the institution side, but something that is asked for from the practitioner side.
I will respond first to what was the personal urgency to address this topic, and I guess for me it was the fact that I would speak to the people running these spaces and their sort of anxiety and fear of having an expiration date, which is completely opposite to what Ozge was saying, and their efforts in trying to come up with solutions and sustainability campaigns and different solutions. Like, for example, Casa Tomada came up with the committee of friends, and so you have new friends, old friends, great friends, and basically it depends on the amount of money that you're giving per year. It ranges from, I think it's 150 reais, which is approximately $75, to 600, 1,000, and 3,000 for the great friends. And that basically was a system that they came up with in order to replace what is called as Lei Rouanet, which is a state-funded mechanism to support culture, where corporations get tax deductions if they support projects. But basically, because it is a residency space and because there is no end product, even though they do publications for every one of their residency programs, they have had a really hard time finding that sort of sponsorship, so they came up with a new solution. And then in terms of public, I think most of the spaces are really thinking about how to address their communities. And I was part of it, even though only one of the spaces is in the neighborhood that I live in, but that's how I sort of became involved with the other spaces. And the fact that they have between spaces that they really use in order to draw people in, their windows that lead onto the street, and it's one of the ways that they try to get people in. And some of them are working with schools and sort of non-profit associations that surround their spaces. To me, was key in thinking about the public programming that would be in the future, which was the original intent of the research. But I felt like I needed to go deeper into understanding what each space contributes in order to think about how can their program be more effective and more appealing to the public.
So basically, because what you present to us was basically this mapping of the different, these 6 chosen spaces. And what are some of the questions? What's going to be the next step if you already are thinking about how to move forward this research? Besides this first mapping, what do you want to do next? What do you want to do in the next few months for developing this project?
For me, it really turned into a way of understanding the space better. And I think it's the first time an effort like this is being done. Nothing has, there have been some articles published in magazines or Time Out or things like that where they mention the alternative spaces, but not really how their funding mechanisms differ, what their identity is about, the sort of programming and how each one is specific and addressing specific needs for artists. So I really want to go more in depth in regards to that. And then I think in the future I would really like to get involved with the programming of some of the spaces. So we'll see how that original information can actually feed ways of coming up with new ways of interacting with one another. Going back to what Andrea was mentioning about the idea of gifting and how that can be counteracted and become much more participative and integrating the public in a way that is not, here's a lecture, somebody spectacular is coming, come with them.
Are there some questions from the floor? Can we let Natalie answer the question, or is this connected to this? That's it.
I also want to make a comment. Maybe you go first.
Or maybe I can go first because it will be very short. I mean, my reading of Osman Hamdi, it's not something, I can't say that it's something that's inscribed to the history or, to the history of Machka. But, so in that sense, it can be an extra, we can say that it's an extra. But if we are to make research, like wide research on the institution of the exhibition in modernist Turkey, I think the first chapter would be Osman Hamdi, and a few chapters would include Machka, the history of Machka. So that's my link there.
So I just want to make a comment. I'm Didem Özbek, co-founder of Peace Science, because the conversation also took place about my practice, let's say, in World of Peace. So we consider Peace as an art project that me and Osman, we run together, but in reality our art practices are different. On the other hand, I totally agree with Vasif, and I would like to thank him, and in the future I would like to have a record of this conversation, because I agree with you. With the last 3 years of a residency program we run, and we suspended it by the end of July, and I'm so happy. With the experience and the happiness is just the end of it. I mean, when you experience this like more established residency program, before we used to collaborate with artists, but as soon as we started an official residency program with international partners funding it, it really was the small scale of any residency program. And I mean, normally we don't have a regular exhibition calendar. We always exhibit the projects that are produced within Peace, so we are more into, we can call it experimentation, and we don't exhibit every work. But after a time, it was really repeating itself. So, I mean, the question of why we decided to end it was we turned at them to when we started, how we started, why we started, and does it appeal to us. Also, our practice is developing. So, the art scene, art market, everything is changing here. 7 years ago, there was no art market. Now it's not emerging, but it's establishing. So, I mean, these are the things like alternative. I can say we are alternative as well, with all the partnerships we develop by now, but we are much more experienced. And we are part of the, I think, art practice.
Thank you. There was another comment in front.
Hello. I just also wanted to make a comment, and basically I can just say primarily maybe from my view from Berlin, as I was based there for quite a long time as curator, but I didn't want to talk about Berlin, but maybe just like about this question of context. You know, there were like these two different presentations, Sao Paulo and Istanbul, and there also for Istanbul, as I'm just like learning about the city and its structures and its rapid change, of course. As I also totally agree to you, there was this question like what is sort of alternative about it, you know, or where is a specific moment maybe still, you know, in like each of the project spaces, and if you think of its benefit, that first of all it's like non-commercial and therefore apparently more free, whatever that means, in its acting. But I think like in, you know, like, of course there is like a huge difference if you like from each scene related to every context of every city, right? Like, I mean, a city like Istanbul, where you have no governmental funding for the arts, but primarily everything is sort of based on private money, in relationship to, let's say, now Berlin, where you are based on governmental money, primarily not on private funders. So I think in these questions, there's always like a difference of, do I open now a project space in Ramallah, Sao Paulo, or Berlin? So, I mean, up on the internationalization in discourse, I think there's always, that is a huge flattening in discussions that I think there is no, you cannot really like sort of, in that sense, you know, like sort of say this is the same here just because people apply same structures. We don't know the other frameworks, or I don't know, you know, in Sao Paulo, how do things work, how do people have access, what is the structure of people who go to these venues at all, etc. So probably, and also in your presentation it was probably, would have been helpful if it would have been a bit more in that sense, like what is the specific program of PIS and BUS, and for people like me, for instance, you know, who did not know, and then it's easier to look at each distinction probably. And yeah, that was just my comment. And also, I had also a similar question with Osman Hamdi Bey and the Machka Gallery. You know, I also was just asking myself if you see it as a grid, or like sort of like a pattern or a grid, sort of how they were thinking to do exhibitions, you know, how to do basically, or how to apply to a space again, like a very thinking as a very spatial moment of how to do exhibition, because like I kind of lost you in your presentation with the dichotomy. You said like the dichotomy in this Osman Hamid Bey, basically there, if you can elaborate on this, maybe also in the end again, like there, I wasn't quite sure where you said, that was like your last two sentences or something, and I didn't follow up on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I will, maybe I will prefer to elaborate on that, on like the continuation of this research, because this is an ongoing research. It's not in its final stage at all yet, so yeah. But thank you very much for the comment.
I would like to echo your notion of the local context playing a huge importance in how we conceive of these spaces and whether they're alternative or not, and alternative to what. I think in the context of Sao Paulo, it's quite interesting to see the difference with Istanbul, having learned a bit about the context here this week, is that in Sao Paulo there are major institutions that have existed for over 5 decades, like the Sao Paulo Biennial, which started in '53, or the Pinacoteca do Estado, Museu de Arte Moderno. These are state-funded spaces, and they also have a program of SESCIs, which are community centers, which have a very intensive programming of art exhibitions. And whereas all of these spaces have incredible exhibitions, they tend to be of local artists. It's very difficult to bring international artists to work in Sao Paulo because the system of customs and import and export of artworks is quite complicated. They have a medieval system, and a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of corruption goes into place. So it's not uncommon for a gallery to send you a newsletter saying, oh, we're having an opening on the 6th of October, and then you get another one saying, oh, it's actually going to be on the 30th of October, because things are stuck in customs. So I think that what these spaces are doing is bringing these people and giving them a chance to interact with the local artists, and that is quite alternative to the models that already exist. And then also connecting the Sao Paulo art scene with the rest of Brazil. So bringing artists from Recife, from Pernambuco, from Porto Alegre to work in Sao Paulo that they otherwise couldn't, because these other states are not as economically wealthy as Sao Paulo is, so it's very difficult for an artist from, say, Recife to come and pay a local studio fee in Sao Paulo to see what's going on in the scene.
There's a question here in the front and then a question in the back.
Hi, I have questions for everyone. And not to belabor the points, but it may be clarifications and further specifications of what Vasif was mentioning. I'll start with Özge, because I'm wondering why you keep harking back to how alternative institutions can actually be part of or can work in concert with larger scale institutions. I find that to be a bit institution-centric. And I'm also wondering how come we take for granted these large scale institutions to be sustainable. They may not be. I mean, what happens if Garanti Bank goes bankrupt? Which it may, well, you know, it's happened before in Turkey, and I mean, Garanti Bank has international partners, but not, you know, it can happen. Second question is to Monica. I was wondering what you meant by alternative economy when you were mentioning Kumsale, and whether you can elaborate more on that, because I find it to be a word that has started to be used more often, but sometimes it feels like it's become this empty signifier that we all ascribe different meanings to. And finally, Nazla, I was wondering why you chose to elaborate on what you did, which was very interesting, in terms of public versus private, instead of perhaps public versus public, in order to sort of delve into how different publics work. And finally, to sort of wrap up what you all said, and you know, starting from why Özge seems to think that, you know, smaller scale institutions should meld in with larger scale institutions instead of creating their own publics. This is what I mean by different publics. This was one of the criticisms that Imece sort of leveled against the biennial. So I was wondering whether it would be a more valuable question, the question of exploration, if these alternative spaces or alternative economies, whether they be these specific ones you've exposed or others, whether it would be more interesting if they were oriented towards creating their own publics and their own discourse, rather than being smaller scales of, as Vasif said, large-scale liberal institutions. Good question there.
So now I realize I haven't basically articulated myself in a clear way, because that melding into larger institutions wasn't something they intended to say or argue. It's mostly about, rather than thinking in binaries, how can we, as practitioners, not necessarily as an artist initiatives, but as the artists themselves, or, you know, as a curator myself, as a writer myself, can I actually be part of the institution building? It's not necessarily melding into the programming or participate in the programming, but think about the programming and what the urgencies are for Istanbul right now, or maybe international level. But it's more about thinking about the urgencies, definitely not like becoming part of it, but becoming part of the institution building itself. The second question. What was the second question?
What happens when parent companies die?
Yeah, of course. That's the question that I asked Vasif Bey the other day. And for me, for instance, ya özür dilerim böyle şey koyarsınız ama yani, I mean, basically my question was that not necessarily about the exhibition programming, but what happens to the archives, and what happens to the research program, the libraries that, you know, the books that we have downstairs, which is probably the major, if I call it like cultural asset of this institution. And can I speak on behalf of you? And for instance, the exhibition might die, and I think we're going to have exhibition spaces anywhere, we can find them anywhere, but the archives and then the collection of documents is going to go to a public institution, and if there's a negotiation in the contract. So for me, it's important to know about that. But still, I do criticize myself for being a little bit ignorant about these things as well, and I mean, you know it quite well, I think. I mean, with that Santor Istanbul incident that happened last year, we realized that we didn't really know much about the deaccession rules. And you know, what happens to a museum in Turkey where they are not a member of SIMAM or, you know, whatever, like larger institutions basically regulating those things. What happens when they decide to just sell works from their collection? Can I actually, you know, think, what kind of an ethical question can we bring? Not necessarily, you know, accusing them for doing such, but also thinking about the legal structure in this country. I mean, just to in order to be able to discuss these things, I think the ownership of the co-ownership, I think these are all related terms. My sentences, they don't make any sense after this hour, but you know what I mean.
I mean, perhaps just to not take for granted that these huge, large-scale institutions are sustainable. It's just one thing. Yeah, they don't seem to be anything.
I'll take off from what you were saying in terms of co-ownership. I think when I said alternative economies, which I agree is a term that's used and abused, with regards to Kunsthalle, it really has to do with co-ownership, and it has to do with the fact that she is basically providing a space and all of her energy, and she is one person devoted entirely to this space. And whenever she takes on an artist, she makes it very clear that the artist has to be a collaborator. She's not just inviting them to bring in work, she's inviting them to do everything with her. So basically they serve the coffee, they serve opening hours, they publish, usually, they self-publish books about the exhibition with a long interview between the person running the space, Marina, and the artist. And when you go to the space on a Thursday afternoon for coffee and to cross some magazines, you'll see the artist actually working on a binding. So in a way that's really about co-ownership and about taking responsibility for the result of how these spaces work. And I think that is pretty alternative to the way that most spaces function.
So it's sort of a barter between the gallery space, the space, and the artist's manual labor, and sort of in concert with each other. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. More of a barter economy.
Yeah.
You had a question from me as well. Can you repeat the question? No.
Sorry. Why did you choose to frame that very amazing subject matter into public versus private instead of public versus public?
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say in a way was that within the privacy, within the particular kind of privacy of that gallery, of that specific gallery environment, a new kind of public was invented. And yeah, I think that was my point. That will be my clearer point in the next stage.
Over here. We're going to take one last question. And
just short, is this public or community? I mean, what do you
can you use a microphone?
What do you mean is like creating a public versus public? But when you are saying else, it sounds like community, creating a community. It doesn't creating a public, but its own community. What I interpret, actually. I don't call it as a public, but more a close community maybe.
Can I add something to that?
Okay, let's add that thing, and I'm going to be really sorry to cut off this extremely generous conversation, which I'm sure you guys are benefiting tons, but we do have a second panel, so let's go to your question.
I had a similar sense actually when I was listening to your presentation, and I think this is something very relevant to us today as well. I feel like I don't know how, honestly I don't know how to define public, because when you showed us these photos and these people, you also mentioned that they're in postures of comfort because they probably know each other and they probably see each other outside of that setting as well. So my question is, doesn't that become a private community? how public is that? And that's why I think thinking of different publics is also an interesting point. And one last thing to add is that I find anonymity to be a very interesting component of anything that's public. Maybe, you know, for further thinking.
Thank you so much.
It's becoming a very interesting conversation at this point because actually it's considering the Turkish environment and its artistic environment and how artists produce and the means of exhibiting and what it means to exhibit and all of these questions. There is this private realm and the public realm, let's say, not even the space. I don't mention in that sense the space is something else. Maybe Nazlı's point was that, you know, there was this invention of a public space rather than the public. Maybe there's a difference there with the public and the public space, where the written history of the Maçka Gallery right now about the exhibitions and all those years, it created some idea of this space and this public and the idea of viewing the artistic works and this, you know, all that aura around it. What that means is that it's in its relation to this artistic world. Maybe there is this difference. I just want to say.
I wish we had more time because we have the co-founder of the gallery, Maçka Sanat Galerisi, Rabia Çapa, here with us, and for artists with her. So I wish we had more time and they could contribute to the discussion, but probably maybe after this formal settings.
Coffee break. During the coffee break.
Maria, hello.
Yes.
I'm really sorry to interrupt again, but this is a question. This is actually a question that is very relevant to Saha and what we have been thinking about, because I guess some of you know that we have started this project with, we want to support initiatives, and Özge is aware of this. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to look out for what the need actually is within the scene. And I wanted to ask Özge first why she chose these initiatives to research, because there are other ones. And the second thing is, perhaps, I mean, thinking about the relationship with the institutions, the initiatives that you chose, most of them existed before the institutions. And as Didem said, you know, they have been changing and reconsidering, like BAS also has been changing and reconsidering how they started and then what they are, what she is now, what BAS is now. Maybe it would be interesting also to look at initiatives that, or also collectives that were established after the institutions, like SALT and like the other museums, I guess, like Proto Cinema and even initiatives like Torum, because what they do comes from a need that is different from what was before, prior to all these institutions existing. And prior, 7 years ago, the scene was very different in artistic production. And actually, I think that the private commercial galleries also really changed what the scene is and how artists are represented and exist.
That requires a long answer, so I'll try to keep it short. In terms of the selection of the artist initiatives, I realize that it's only a selection of like many. Selection is a bad word, but you know what I mean. But I think the priority was that with the artists that basically established these spaces, I had already started a conversation about what the questions that things were basically like throwing to the table. You know, what it means to make an exhibition, what it means to what is the meaning of basically starting a residency. So I think that that's kind of a continuation of an ongoing conversation. Probably it's not a very good argument, I would say, but there has to be a number of people that I have to focus on. So probably that's not really a good answer to your question. But in terms of the other initiatives, I'm personally much more interested in the new generation of initiatives that are funded by or supported by collectors and art patrons. And we were just talking about it the other day because Saha, Spot, and also a collector space where I work at, this is a new generation of spaces where basically patrons and contemporary art collectors, they say, okay, let's start with a small scale thing, and what kind of a different programming they're going to do in the future, and what kind of urgencies or priorities they're going to have in relation to the changing artist spaces. That's my major question right now, regardless of this research or regardless of this paper.
And are they sustainable?
Yeah, of course. That's the major question, as usual. We'll talk.
To take over. This is an amazing public, I have to say. It's not public?
No.
Well, Michael Warner, that Nazli was mentioning, says that the public is formed of strangers, and I know a few faces here, and also other faces that I don't know, which makes it actually a public. And this is interesting.
I'm not subject to any hierarchy.
The public is subjected to hierarchies?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. What would you like to be called?
Peer.
Peer. Oh, I like that. I thought you were going to say Peter, as in your name. That would be also good. We do have another panel, which I think is going to be quite interesting, and I really hope that you can stay to provide as much feedback as you provided to these three curators. So I want to thank the three of you and all of you for all your amazing questions.
I want to start off by talking about an event that happened 2 weeks prior to the uprisings at Gezi Park, when protesters interrupted a lecture/performance delivered as part of the public alchemy education program of the 13th Istanbul Biennial, with demonstrations about gentrification in Istanbul. And this performance lecture was specifically addressing the relationship between art and financial capital, a relevant issue here. And the protesters were responding specifically to the biennial as a gentrification tool. And for me, this particular event highlighted the complexities of producing site-specific work in cities such as Istanbul, where development and gentrification are highly contested, and producing work in the public sphere is difficult when public and private are not easily defined. I'm just going to describe a little bit about this performance in case you all haven't heard about it or read about it. So on the 10th of May 2013, Catherine Vermeer and Ronnie Harrimans presented a lecture performance as part of the 13th Istanbul Biennial Public Program. And the subject was the commodification of their home/studio into a liquid financial product called the Art House Index. And the main component of the event was a Skype session with the financial analyst Frank Goodman, who's a sort of fictitious financial analyst, but there nonetheless. And together the artist and analyst discussed the issues relating to the commodification of the artist's home come studio, which was also functions as a real estate property come work of art, and private space come public space to a certain degree. And my interest in this event is how it highlighted tensions surrounding public and private space in Istanbul that have largely been brought about by urban development. So as I understand it, there, I have to admit, the protesters who interrupted this event were specifically targeting the biennial as a gentrifying agent, which is financially supported by Koç Holdings, which is Turkey's largest industrial conglomerate involved in banking, oil, gas, and defense. And at 10-minute intervals throughout the lecture performance, each protester would stand up in the middle of the room, wearing a shirt and displaying a banner printed with the names of gentrifying neighborhoods in Istanbul, which they would drape over themselves and then collapse to the floor. And then each of these protesters was swiftly removed by the biennial staff so the performance could continue uninterrupted. And then a couple of weeks later, a larger unrelated set of protests developed in Gezi Park, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And these demonstrations highlighted on a larger scale the complex relationships between public and private space in Istanbul, whereas the this protest, or during the performance of the lecture, was specifically commenting on the biennial and the sponsors. So they were separate groups of protesters, as I understood it. So Vermeer and Harriman's lecture was contentious as it embodies a multitude of the challenges facing artists making work, particularly site-specific work in Istanbul. And to better understand why this lecture performance was so contentious, I'm hoping to explore issues relating to urban space and publicness in Istanbul, and how artists employing principles of site specificity have dealt with these issues within the context of the Istanbul Biennial. I just wanted to quickly dip into a definition of site specificity or definitions of site specificity, which was set forth in Miwan Quad's One Place After Another, which argue that in advanced art practices of the past 30 years, the operative definition of the site has been transformed from a grounded, fixed, and actual place to a discursive vector, which is ungrounded, fluid, and virtual. And her book provides an overview of how site-specific practice evolved within the West from autonomous artworks as the site of work in the 1960s and 70s to the institution as the site of critique. Then to the discursive site, which embraces non-art and social issues, followed by a discursive site where the artist is instigator and therefore operates as site, him or herself. And in her definition of artist as site, Kwan refers to Hal Foster's essay, The Artist as Ethnographer, in which he provides an overview of the shift towards a quasi-anthropological practice in contemporary art in which the subject matter is cultural identity. And so in Istanbul, I think some of these Western definitions of site specificity are at odds with an urban space that lacks clear definition in many stakeholders, as well as layered histories. And this gives site-specific work in Istanbul more complex parameters than the sites defined by Kwan and Foster, as issues of private and public space become key terms when discussing site here, I think in the Western context, meanings of public and private are taken for granted to a degree. However, and this is according to Ugur Tanyeli, which I'm not sure, I would welcome feedback about whether or not this is the person to quote. But he's addressed issues of public and private space within the Turkish context, stating that private spaces in Turkey are related to intimacy, secrecy, and a place concealed from others, or also loneliness. And then in contrast, public space expresses what appeals to all and is accessible to all. The term public in Turkish is generally used to define a place where the state applies regulations to the individuals, which represents power and ideology, and the public will is valid in terms of controlling dress and behavior and allowing the coverage of heads for banning demonstrations. That definition is also several years old, I have to say. It's about 5 years old, I think. So in an encyclopedic guide to Istanbul, created by architects and architectural historians, including Tanyeli, the authors identified that Istanbul hosts various urban cultures and reflects contemporary street level and urban problems in a sprawling multiple ways, thus presenting the Istanbul Biennial with a multitude of materials and perhaps challenges. This year's biennial, in response to the changing definitions of public space in Istanbul, decided to remove itself from the urban public realm as a venue to allow for this negotiation of space to continue, attempting to avoid interfering with the natural process happening in the space. And then I wanted to look at another older work that also kind of highlights for me some of the complexities of making site-specific work by an international artist working in Istanbul. And I'm not sure if he necessarily faced challenges in terms of formatting, but I think it's an interesting work for myself to look at least. For the 10th Istanbul Biennial, Rainer Ganahall produced a video work, which was 4.5 hours long, entitled Silenced Voices. And this video presented a survey of the topography of the murder sites of 21 silenced German journalists killed in different areas throughout Istanbul. And Ganahall revisited these sites, marking in chalk on the street in Turkish and English their names, professions, and the dates of their murders. And then he cycled between these makeshift memorial sites, recording an overview of Istanbul's topography. And this wasn't intended to be a sort of touristic, tour through Istanbul. It was more to connect and memorialize the murders of these journalists through this bicycle ride. And he said that as he was producing this work and going to visit the sites and writing in chalk on the streets, he was being offered people's personal accounts of what had happened and how they their memories of these specific events. So while he was doing that, sorry, I'm just catching up with myself. So I think this is a really sort of interesting public-private moment as well. And Tanyeli, when he was producing these works, or like within the public realm and marking on the cement, he was pulled into questioning by the police for simply writing in chalk on the pavement and asked to explain in detail what the project was that he was working on. And I think that the work, although it wasn't site-specific in that it resulted in a film, it did manage to successfully engage with the sites and with public space, even if not directly. So for his actual presentation, he presented a map and a video work with the locations of where the journalists were killed and his cycle tour. And I think this work is particularly interesting as a work that highlights the issues of production and site specificity in the public realm. And I think one of my questions is, like, how would that work have existed if it had existed as a site-specific in public space work? Or was it only possible as video work because of, I think, the complex situation there? Anyways, so in Becoming Istanbul, an encyclopedic guide to Istanbul, it was postulated that a spatial research of Istanbul biennials would reveal, in most, the urban transformation of Istanbul and strange, indescribable situations in this transformation process. In this context, another aspect of the Istanbul biennial is the fact that it has entered an exact reverse route, contradicting the claim that biennials mainly provide acceleration to the city's cultural catalyst, serve as festivalization, contribute to the branding of the city, and become instrumentalized in urban transformations. This year's edition of the biennial highlights these complexities as the aims of operating within the public realm in Istanbul has led to a shift of venues to private art spaces to allow for the transformative effects of the Gezi Park demonstrations to play out in the public realm, whilst bringing some of these issues indoors. The curator's decision to abandon the public spaces selected as biennial sites during the 13th edition to explore issues of publicness indicates that urban transformation is a sensitive, ongoing, and unpredictable project. It appears that one of the challenges facing the biennial is how to create site-specific work that engages with the public realm, and how to avoid, as artist Ahmet Damoud stated in response to the 12th biennial, creating a biennial that resembles an art fair disengages from the public space, particularly as there is a great deal of material within the public spaces of Istanbul for artists to engage with. I think this is an interesting moment for the Istanbul Biennial, and with a focus on publicness versus public space, I think it's worth considering how works within the biennial and its public program address some of the issues of urbanization and the public realm without physically engaging with them, and what changes, if any, may happen in the coming months within the public space of Istanbul as a result of this silence produced by this biennial's absence. Thank you.
My voice falters. At the year European Biennial Network panel discussion on biennials, short-term effect or long-term results at the 2008 Liverpool Biennial, Paul O'Neill stated that contemporary art biennials have become incredibly self-reflexive about their own articulation and their need to reflect on their own location, place or context. My research takes this quote as a departure point to explore how current curatorial practices focus on the site of the biennial as both the theme and the location of the display of art. Viewing the biennial as a form of exhibition making, and thus as a curatorial practice, I examine the theoretical discourse underpinning this curatorial approach, as well as the practical implications for curatorial work within this setting. In particular, I focus on what I have identified as locatedness, a process whereby the curator reflects on the location and context of the site of art production and display through working from within that site. I use the 13th Istanbul Biennial as a case study to explore two central questions. Is locatedness used as a curatorial approach through the construct of the biennial? And does this approach respond to the contradiction of a cosmopolitan centre which considers its own art production peripheral, I should say. This presentation here will give an insight into the current stage of my research, as everyone else, focusing particularly on its methodological development and the theoretical framework. So please bear in mind, a lot of this was written before I came here, and obviously a lot of the perspective will change, so welcoming feedback just as I did as well. I began this research as part of a larger goal to pursue PhD studies into the rise of post-1989 peripheral biennials. It was only when I started studying biennials that I realised what the Istanbul Biennial's contribution really was as part of the contribution of new internationalism, where previously Western notions such as international, global or cosmopolitan were redefined through the development and realisation of large-scale contemporary art exhibitions and events. Before embarking on this research project, I kept reading from biennial scholars, curators and art critics about how the most interesting biennials were those, like the Istanbul Biennial, that had a strong connection with the local environment, particularly those that resisted the traditional white cube context of the museum world and extended outward through the selection and commissioning of site-specific works throughout cities and towns. The questions kept nagging in the back of my mind, such as, can a biennial really address the local in this way? And why is it that the local has become so desirable as a curatorial framework? And lastly, how can the voices of those from within the local contribute to this discourse too? Methodologically, the case of the current 13th Istanbul Biennial is thus useful for exploring how locatedness, as a curatorial approach, can find answers to these theoretical questions, and further explore what I perceive as a centre-periphery dichotomy embedded in the location's history of art production. Whilst this particular research project cannot delve fully into the cultural discourse of such heavily loaded and contested terms of east, west, centre and periphery, it does acknowledge that it is through the rise of biennials in cities such as Istanbul that has changed the path of such discourse and indeed resulted in a continuous redefinition of such terminology. And here I refer particularly to the published discussions between various biennial curators and artists in publications such as Global Tendencies, Globalism and the Large-Scale Exhibition in a 2003 edition of Art Forum, and also Lotte Philipson's essay, Exhibiting Artistic Modernism and Modernity, in 2010. Similarly, while a comparison of all biennials or an analysis of the histories of all previous editions of the Istanbul Biennial was not feasible for this particular research, I instead compared previous Istanbul Biennial editions to identify locatedness within recent and current curatorial approaches. Particularly, I investigated the history of the declared purposes of recent editions of the Istanbul Biennial, specifically the 9th, 10th and 11th Biennials, which I believe saw some of the most radical changes towards a focus on the local within the biennial's curatorial history. I compare these with that of the conceptual framework and curatorial strategies of the current 13th Istanbul Biennial as laid out in the announcement of the biennial's theme in early 2013. This year's theme, Mum, Am I a Barbarian, seeks to address the local through exploring the notion of the public domain as a political forum. The biennial takes place during a time of great political tension, And while we've seen many biennials begin as a result of trauma, war, and political change throughout history, I am interested in this particular biennial's development and operation through political change, and whether it can be a realistic platform for discussion on current political topics of urban redevelopment, protest, and free speech. What is also interesting is the biennial status as an international event that seeks to do what all other international biennials do, to simultaneously bring the international art scene to Istanbul and to keep Istanbul on the international art map. But can it do this at the same time as addressing the very real and urgent local issues? And do the biennial's international aims undo the very engagement with the local? In developing the theoretical framework for this research, my investigation into what constitutes locatedness as a curatorial approach and why it has become so desirable, coincidentally, brought me right back to the Istanbul Biennial. From the mid-2000s onwards, several texts emerging from the growing discourse surrounding biennials highlight the reasons for the turn in curatorial thinking towards location, place, or context as both a theme and site of contemporary art display. Claire Doherty's 2004 essay, Location, Location, Location, argues that at the time of Charles Escher and Vasif Kortun's 2005 edition of the Istanbul Biennial, simply titled Istanbul, a focus on the local was something of a biennial trend. She found that, and I quote, "A cursory perusal of recent biennial literature reveals how dominant the rhetoric of context and engagement has become." Doherty also suggested that this change in focus stems from changes in how curators were supporting artistic practices at the time. She cited Liverpool's 2004 Biennial, Manifesto 5, and Berlin Biennial 3, pointing out that these city biennials developed a complex range of strategies to support the visiting artist, drawing on the precedent of the residency and commissioning agency model to reimagine place as a situation, a set of circumstances, geographical location, historical narrative, group of people or social agenda to which the artist might respond. When looking at texts in which curators themselves reflect on their work as curators of biennials, locatedness can also be identified as an essential part of the creative process in curating. For example, in the words of Hu Hanru, curator of the 10th Istanbul Biennial edition, to focus on the local was, as he says, a unique opportunity to explore the creative and innovative possibilities offered by the occasion. He also stated that, more than ever, biennials of the future should be an occasion to conceive and construct new localities capable of responding to the age of globalization. This kind of effect of the local recalls the 1997 text, The Lure of the Local, Senses of Place in a Multi-Centered Society, by Lucy Lippard, for whom place is the locus of desire. For Lippard, each time one enters a new place, they become one of the ingredients of an existing hybridity, which is really what all local places consist of. She says, by entering that hybrid, we change it, and in each situation, we may play a different role. These very personal connections both Hanru and Lippard seem to share with a sense of place suggest that focusing on the location offers a kind of personal cultural fulfillment for the curator themselves. And one step further, as Ranyard Hoskoda suggests, biennials help us to redraft our inherited atlas of belonging. On the other hand, the use of locatedness is identified as part of wider changes within the field of curating, particularly as curators began to respond to the increasing nature of site-specific artistic practices. As Paul O'Neill describes, by 2006, the curator-producer had emerged as the linchpin in negotiations between artist and place. Thus, this shift in curatorial thinking towards the local seems to me a natural evolution for the role of the curator as the number of biennials rose, and more experimental, autonomous forms of curating took place outside of the institution. This is also illustrated by Carlos Basualdo in the 2008 essay, The Unstable Institution. When curating biennials, the appeal of the local might be one thing, but what happens when that local in question has a contested identity? Here it is worth exploring the various perspectives of the identity of Istanbul as both the centre and a periphery in terms of its contemporary art production. From a Western perspective, it seems Istanbul is still considered as an emerging art scene, and I'm referring here directly to the term used in ICI's description of the Istanbul Seminar Program to describe the ongoing development of the arts infrastructure here. When responding to the call for the seminar, I began to question whether the term emerging was synonymous with the term peripheral, and wondered what Istanbul's own perspective was of itself in terms of contemporary art production. The Istanbul Biennial is often touted as the main catalyst for the development of arts infrastructure here, and as Angela Haratunyan, Aras Ozgun, and Eric Goodfield stated, from its very inception was primarily aimed at presenting newly established and emerging artists from peripheral contexts in relation to dominant Western European and North American art scenes. This self-identification of the city as a periphery is also evident, I think, in Vasif Kortun's 1992 edition of the Biennial, entitled Production of Cultural Difference, which explicitly aimed to extend the efforts begun by such exhibitions such as Magician de la Terre and the Decade Show to showcase work from outside the West. This positioning of Istanbul as a periphery of contemporary art production and display through the Biennial is also acknowledged in Tomo Atagok and Susan Platt's 2008, The Digestible Other. Atagok and Platt argue that previous curatorial emphases on internationalism through the selection of an increasing number of international artists rather than local Turkish artists since its inception led to the westernization of the Biennial itself. Their assessment of the Biennial as a homogenized spectacle suggests to me that one can only strive to become a centre if one lies on the periphery. Among more recent editions of the Biennial, curated by Hanru, Escher, Kortun, and the collective What, How, and For Whom, sought to address and possibly even reverse the outdated notion of Istanbul as a periphery. The desire of Koç, the Biennial's main sponsor, to see Istanbul become a contemporary art world centre undermines any such objectives. In contrast, the Biennial organisers, IKSV, claim that the Istanbul Biennial is now one of the most prestigious large-scale contemporary arts events alongside Sydney, Venice, and Sao Paulo. Critics such as Bartosz Ustek also argue that Istanbul can no longer be considered a periphery site for contemporary art production due to larger economic changes. She states, Istanbul lies between Sao Paulo and Hong Kong, Moscow and Abu Dhabi. This reconfiguration of the geographical marking is significant in understanding and articulating the current strata of Istanbul's artistic landscape. It is no longer the door to the East, as the East is reinitiating its own self, nor it is a bridge that commensurates two distinct positions and worldviews, such as East to West and North to South. Over the course of the past 6 days, I have sought to find out how locatedness as a curatorial approach might reconcile these two opposing views of Istanbul's contemporary art production as both a periphery and a centre. Similarly, I have tried to identify if Istanbul's art scene is still emerging, if it still considers itself to be peripheral, and if emerging is even synonymous with peripheral. To find a range of perspectives answering these questions, discussions with key figures, and the development of Istanbul's art scene have provided a context for me. Similarly, questions directed to individuals involved in the organisation of the 13th Istanbul Biennial, such as Andre Phillips and Fulya Adamci, have given me the opportunity to directly question curatorial strategies of the Biennial, particularly on how one stages a large-scale international biennial whilst operating within and responding to the local social and political situation it claims to address. Upon my return to Berlin, I hope to clarify these thoughts by comparing my observations of the Biennial over the past week with the discussion results and theoretical backdrop I have introduced here. I will explore the differences between the Istanbul Biennial's curatorial intentions and its lived realities, with particular attention to its responses to the local during the recent period of social and political change. And finally, I aim to draw conclusions about what locatedness will mean for the curation of future biennials, and whether, as a curatorial approach, it allows us to better respond to complex and contested sites that are simultaneously peripheries and centres. Thank you.
Basically, this paper is part of my broader research, which is related both to my practice as an independent and to my practice as part of a vessel organization, an organization that I have co-founded in 2011. So basically, this paper aims at exploring curatorial approaches to the field of socially engaged art practices and at analyzing different issues that this declination of curating implies, such as the relationship between art and curatorial practice and the shift from curating exhibitions to curating processes. In particular, I would like to address the position of the curator within the merging of the context and the content in regard to production of immaterial, dialogue and process-based art projects. When art operates in troubled or marginal context, it can become part of a process of resilience through which to reactivate or reinvent individual and collective life, even when there are not the conditions to do so. But I'm asking myself a few questions. How can artists and curators apply operational strategies in specific contexts while keeping ties with international languages and global debates? And if marginality is the space for a possibility for the undetermined to take place and for the individual and the collective subjectivities to give birth to new relational systems and ecologies, the global debate seems still to be the realm where to feed back micro-narratives and where to recontextualize and build new networks of solidarity. Indeed, artists and curators involved in social practices share common international codes and languages, and at the same time root their agency in very specific contexts that most of the time are not necessarily connected to the art apparatus. I have chosen Culture in Action as a reference, not really as a case study, but most as a reference, because it produced a shift in the relation between artists and public space, from the artwork monument to relational and process-based practices. Mary Jane Jacob can be considered as the pioneer of the collaboration between artist and curator in the interaction with communities and in the dialogue with specific contexts. I find relevant, after 20 years, to rethink this shift and to recontextualize the curatorial practice within the social sphere in a European and a Euro-Mediterranean perspective, especially in the current situation where it seems that different kinds of narratives, hegemonic narratives, try to define what is Europe and what is the Mediterranean. I will refer to Culture in Action and to Traffic, the exhibition that gave birth to the notion of relational aesthetics, which is considered as one of the forerunners of social practice. By articulating this parallel narrative, I would like to highlight the different curatorial approaches at stake and their relationship with the traditional art apparatus, as well as the different connotations that the notion of participation they reveal. Culture in Action took place between 1993 and 1995 in Chicago. It was curated by Mary Jane Jacob and supported by the organization Sculpture Chicago. The curator invited a group of 8 artists to respond to certain issues connected to marginal communities or peripheral areas of Chicago. For example, Simon Grennan and Christopher Sperandio worked with workers at Nestlé Candy Factory to conceive and produce the new candy bar. Daniel Martinez organized a multi-ethnic parade through Maxwell Street area. Mel Ziegler and Kate Erickson worked with lodgers at the low-cost housing project. Suzanne Lessig placed 100 small boulders around the loop, each bearing a plaque with the name of a woman who is important to the fabric of Chicago's diverse culture. And Mark Dyan created the Chicago Urban Ecology Action Group with high scholars from 2 locations, one an upscale Lincoln Park school, the other the impoverished West Side. Culture in Action not only represented a critique towards the traditional declinations of public art, but it also created the basis for the development of new strategies in the curatorial field, now willing to explore the notion of collaboration and mediation, and to borrow methodologies from social sciences while working on a multidisciplinary level. A few years later, in 1996, Nicolas Bourriaud curated Traffic at the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Bordeaux. The exhibition introduced the notion of relational in contemporary art in Europe as a way to subvert the logic of active producers versus passive viewer in name of a more participatory attitude towards the audience. Carl Friedman states that traffic, and I quote, and Bourdieu's concept of relationality were just too unspecific to be capable of defining a new art, especially when so many of the works did little to support the exhibition's premise. This was an ambitiously founded exhibition which was only able to provide the viewer with a largely familiar array of objects and images, with the primary beneficiaries of traffic tending to be the participating artists and their associates. Bourdieu may need to look at what actually constitutes the socio-political determinants of his interhuman space. End quote. I see a huge gap between the two curatorial approaches I have just described above. The key element is the context itself. If culture in action has been specifically conceived for the public space, and especially as a way to redefine artistic and curatorial practices within the public discourse, from the exhibition making to the creation of relational context, traffic has insisted on the already defined art system, producing relational movements within the museum walls and creating new ways of art consumption in the institution space. In these terms, I see that culture in action has probably influenced more deeply the curatorial practices happening now, thanks to its need to break the institutional four walls of the art field. Nevertheless, I also think that in this specific moment of institutional uncertainties, the social engaged approach, which would eventually imply the presence of a social curator, should be contribute to the redefinition of the institutional apparatus, trying to resist any form of cooptation from the traditional system while becoming a generative force that could help rethink the system itself. Culture in Action introduces a model of curating which is based on some specific aspects: collaboration and mediation as key elements, context as main source of content, visibility versus invisibility. Collaboration plays a very central role in what we could call social curating, as well as the material and immaterial dialogue and exchange with the environment made of people, knowledge, memory, and institutions it is interacting with. In my practice, this is the kind of environment I constantly try to question through a sort of ethnographic approach in order to produce a system made of relationship and solidarity between the parties. This is what I call ecology. So the choice to tend towards this idea of ecology, which is in my opinion the equilibrium resulting from a temporary stage of conflict, reveals the attempt to keep the dialogue, the logos, between the single elements of an existing context or environment, alive. This process leads to the creation of a social and cultural discourse which exists outside of the author-producer, because it is the result of a collective, multifaceted, generative interaction. In this perspective, the curatorial research becomes a collaborative fieldwork, an investigation of a specific context which takes place on an interdisciplinary and polyphonic level. Andrea Fraser states that institutions of art should not be seen as autonomous fields, separate from the rest of the world, the same way that we are not separate from the institution. And as part of the institutions of art, curators and all art practitioners should establish relationships with what is inside and outside of the four walls of the institution, in order to have a critical and ethical gaze on it, and to keep the process of self-questioning and self-reflecting. As Félix Guattari points in his essay The Free Ecologies, art and aesthetics play a very important role in the process of creation of a more ecological imaginary and subjectivity, especially in the current post-capitalist scenario, which rules not only the production of material goods, but also the production of sign, syntax, and meaning. The philosopher states that the task, I quote, "The task facing us in the future is not that of seeking a mind-numbing and infantilizing consensus, but of cultivating dissensus and the singular production of existence. The goal of ecological praxis," he explains, should be to activate isolated and repressed singularities. It seems essential to me that we organize new micropolitical and microsocial practices, new solidarities, new
a new gentleness, while at the same time applying new aesthetic and analytical practices to the formation of the unconscious." End quote. It seems to me that curatorial practice in relation to socially engaged art practices should be more and more connected to the aforementioned micropolitics of desire and to the attempt to make so-called underrepresented communities or marginal narratives visible. In these terms, the role of the curator has more and more points in common with the one of the artist as social activator or facilitator, as the one that permits others' creativity to emerge and to become a channel for political affirmation of individual and collective existence. The overlap of these two roles can be very generative on the one hand, resulting in a collaborative dynamic between artist and curator, and between them and the community, or it can deform the development of a project in case the curatorial mediation starts from prejudice and stereotype. I will refer again to Mary Jane Jacob, who in 1992 invited the artist René Green to interact with Sculpture Chicago and to conceive a project for the city of Chicago. Before the artist's visit, Jacob created a network of relationships with some local communities and started to visualize possible interventions that the artist could do in order to establish partnership with local organizations. The curator ended up highlighting the identity of the artist and creating a narrative while imagining that Green's African-American origin could determine interest in the racial conflicts going on in Chicago. Mimon Kwan describes the event saying that, I quote, "The artist realized fairly quickly that her interest in pursuing the architectural history of the city, especially the legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright and his previous school, as a possible topic for a public art project, was not in concert with Jacob and Sculpture Chicago's exclusive focus on her as an African-American artist, and their desire for a project that would highlight issues of urban racial conflicts or history. This institutional projection led to a parting of ways between Green and Sculpture Chicago soon after the artist's visit to the city." End quote. In this case, the mediation between the curator, the artist, and the context reveals some problematic aspects, not only because of the trajectories that Jacob drew for the artist project, but also because of the expectations that the curator and the institution had towards Green's intervention. It seems to me that the ethnographic methodology adopted by Jacob could not be the exclusive base for curating the process, as it lacked any transverse approach as well as any collaborative dialogue with the artist. In the last year, I have co-curated a project called Radio Materiality, which is a project by Vessel, and it has started basically in December 2012. Radio Materiality is the tool through which Vessel, the name of the organization again, intends to understand and redefine already existing social and cultural dynamics through the lens of art and culture. The radio is currently stimulating participatory and multidisciplinary actions in order to expand the knowledge related to different issues in the region. The region is called Puglia, in the south of the country. So to interpret its own identity and to reflect on the way the public sphere is perceived and can be empowered. Thanks to the radio, Vessel intends to give voice to alternative narratives that do not fit into the hegemonic ones. To do so, we instigate collaborative and collective artistic practices that involve different points of view and different approaches. The project involves Italian and international artists that are working with us in approaching local communities and in trying to develop with them alternative ways of participating in the public sphere. Each artistic intervention is the result of a deep dialogue between the curators and the artists involved. We have operated as curators and as co-producers of each project, accompanying the artists in the accumulation of knowledge about the territory and highlighting specific issues they could deal with. Thus, we are working on an alternative interpretation of the region and of its society that will be made public through online podcasts and radio programs. I can briefly talk about each project that we have developed, and then I will go to the conclusion. So one of the projects is made by the artist Bisan Abu Eish, and the project aims to investigate the state of confinement around the life of a segment of political refugees in the region of Puglia, who face the multiple difficulties connected with wars and the social political problems in their countries, which push them to refuge to Western world seeking for shelter and better circumstances. So basically the artist now is working with this group of refugees, trying to build together with them a radio that, so to learn together with them how to build a radio station in order to allow them to use this tool in the future. Elena Cologni has been working on a series of conversations between herself and some others from the region to share the emotional and psychogeographical condition of motherhood. So the meetings have instigated a reflection on the sociological concept of trust and on the social and urban dimension that being a mother implies. Jaume Ferret has developed the project Post-Rara, Bari, an attempt to hybridize situated knowledges and practices about local feminist heritage, gender and sexual identities, with an ongoing research on the uses, functions and the accidents of voice. And is doing so by exploring the format of the workshop. Another project is called Blue Oltremare, and it's by the artist Leone Contini, who investigated the notion of reciprocity between Puglia and Albania by building a non-made antenna in order to capture the Albanian TV signal from the old harbour of Bari, the capital city of Puglia. This process has involved many local people and the Albanian community in Bari. Akantopal's project, iTunes, Immigrant Tunes, was focused on the status of migrants in the region, through a selection of music that was chosen basically by the migrants that are living in the city. So basically Akan was trying to investigate the artistic taste of these people rather than dealing necessarily with their condition of migrants. So it was about their individuality and not their sense of their belonging to a specific community of marginalized group. So the project has become a terrain for the experimentation of practices which are more and more related to the idea of curating as activating processes of transmission, in which both the artist and the curator are mediating between the visibility and the visibility of stories and situations. In this perspective, the curator becomes activator of micropolitics and of self-emancipation through self-narrative and self-historicization. Collectively, he or she can produce multiple interpretations of history by mediating and transmitting hidden or minor story. On a very small scale, he or she can rewrite history by collecting and channeling plural, dissonant, unearthed narratives, as well as organize them through a diversity of means. So, basically the aim of the project is to investigate individual and collective desires embedded in everyday life and in micro context, and to privilege a non-event dimension that does not necessarily require the existence of an audience, but that intervenes in the daily flow of life. So basically now I'm still in the process of working on this project, so I think that my research on this paper and the research for the ICIs will be a bit parallel to the development of the project. So basically, hopefully in 2 months I will be able to theorize a bit more on what is my curatorial strategies in this specific context. Thank you.
Audience for being so patient with us. It's nearly 6 o'clock, and just also to be fair and give substantial feedback to 3, I think, very substantial presentations, I would like to ask your indulgence and that we sort of just give ourselves 20 minutes for the whole thing. Is that okay for everybody?
Yes.
Yeah, I just fear that if people sort of are starting to walk out, it might be also quite discouraging for them, and on the other hand, I will absolutely promise it is not going over 20 minutes. So, thank you very much. I will, as I had the privilege to already read two of the presenters' works, I will also not take too much time. I think you as an audience have been incredible in the previous session, and I do think they also need to have that kind of feedback. However, linking back to the very first session, we can see both very similar problematics, but also new possibilities emerging out of what had been considered a kind of core topics. One going about what kind of alternatives, strategies or tactics. De Certeau would probably speak more of tactics because strategies would be more those of from the government side, whilst tactics are developed by those who have not to say or who have in a subvertive mode to find their own way of survival. And my first question, I will do it not as a group, but I start with Claire. My first question to you, Claire, I think probably the session previous to that has helped you also quite substantially to go further in one of the great problematic spaces you still need to get your head around, and that is between what you had first set up as a private versus public. But I also think that probably now you would pitch it slightly different. And I would just invite you to maybe also think around the public in more nuances. Maybe, and that is my question to you, could you imagine that rather than opposing the private as the kind of interior moment, to look at what qualifies for you various publics, public spaces, public spheres within Istanbul, because you try to be also quite precise in regard to a space in conflict and how site-specificity in an artwork then can sort of negotiate that conflictual space. So could you just briefly also resituate maybe that public a little bit?
I can try. I think I think there are various publics, and that's exactly what I'm interested in, is trying to unpick, when you make a site-specific work and you put it out in, and I'm talking about site-specific work in terms of like a work within the public realm. I'm using that word already. But, you have multiple audiences for that work, and if it's part of a biennial, you have this art world audience, and then you have a much more general public who's engaging with that work. And I think I'm trying to figure out, yes, what are those publics, basically.
And maybe another part which you had tried to sort of separate out is actually probably around ownership. Who owns the place? And if it is private capital which owns it, yet it is used by large amounts of people, I think you just would need to define a bit more precisely those various nuances under which unluckily one too simple term is keeping tightly very differing notions. And maybe then, if I could go to you, Kate, I do think you provided a very inspiring idea around various peripheries, various ideas also what locatedness could mean. And maybe what I would suggest is if we forget a little bit about the centers, I think centers are mythical. I think each center is again a periphery of something. But if we would look at locatedness as not a single event, but rather as something in connectivity to others, as you had talked of before, then maybe we should also insert into locatedness the idea of specific times. And I think that may be, if you could think also around Istanbul is not Istanbul. What happened there might also be both an activating agent, a disturbing agent, but also something which is both for the Biennale organizers and I think for the larger environment something which suddenly brought to locatedness another kind of color. And maybe if then the question around how can a curator act like in a way not apart from, but as inside that, I think then one would probably be able to also say that temporalities do matter. So that's more a remark than a question to you. But maybe what I would be interested in to hear a little bit more, as you spoke in the very beginning, how much this moment here had influenced you. If you just could sort of also open up one or two of those questions which are now of the very recent quality.
I'll try as well. Yeah, how to sum up the last 6 days is really quite tricky. I think one of the things that I'm tempted to do with the research is to perhaps maybe even focus in on particular aspects of what I call locatedness, and maybe even focus specifically on one central player. So perhaps either Fulya Adamti or Andrea Phillips, because it's quite difficult to take into account these ideas of how one might approach the local as a generalized way. And I think, you know, in reading this out and presenting it to everyone after what I've learned over the last 6 days, I'm now realizing that it's perhaps a bit maybe silly to kind of generalize over the last few biennials to try and pull out this thread, and that perhaps there would be more value in looking at this specific edition. Because one thing that came out of the last 6 days in the discussions, particularly with Fulya, was this idea of a sense of self and a sense of identity and what you bring to your curatorial practice. And this is something that I'm incredibly interested in terms of my own practice, being an Australian, living in Berlin, having lived in the UK, that do you take your baggage with you, and how does that affect your practice? And how does that enable or disable you to engage with the local? And so it was quite interesting when I asked her about what she thought about being a Turkish woman curating the biennial, how that had impacted on her practice, and the answer was it's quite a big one. I'm not going to repeat the whole thing, but hopefully I can sort of use that as a basis, I think, for where this research will end up going. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, perfectly so. It's for me. And then Anna, in fact, you have been in some ways already suggesting ways forward to allow curatorship not necessarily to become this kind of dictatorial space of where the curator has his artists, and especially when you think around locatedness, one would feel a little bit frightened to see curators who really have already all their problems clarified and also have specified their research sites in a way that they just need to artists to sort of fill in. And I think in that, Anna, you suggest as a kind of a space of dialogue where actually the curator is more the mediator, is the one who sets up the space of the possible. And you talk about culture in action as one thing which actually tries in a, let's say, you spoke about the gentle approach. I love the word gentle.
It's not mine.
I know, but I still like the word. However, there is just one space which is open to doubt. And that is, at the end of the day, yes, the curator interacts with a constituency, interacts with the artist, and makes something possible of a dialogue, which hopefully will end up in also something which has an aesthetic format of its own self. Whilst we could say the process of its own is a form of aesthetics. Nevertheless, the problem remains that there is an audience. That means it is, do you exclude the others? Is it necessarily that constituency which has been part of the process, which is also your audience? And what happens if it's beyond? And how do you frame that?
Well,
The audience, of course, is there. But as in the last projects I've been creating, especially with Bessel, or let's say our practice, I have to speak about us, not just me, because we are working together since a while. All our practice has been much more related to the idea of the process rather than the result, which is not for us a way to say we are against the artwork, we are against the exhibition, but we think that it's necessary to have a sort of pause, a break from this idea of the overproduction, and to have some sort of space for resistance, which is a mental space where one can reflect and share reflections about how to produce more responsibly. So what I've been doing with Bessel, what we do is to open up moments of discussion and of interaction with people, not necessarily as practitioners. It really depends on what, on which are the issues we want to face. But in general, we try to open and to share as much as possible, but in a discursive way, in a biological way. So this is why also yesterday I was saying that I have problems with this idea of the final exhibition, where you should get everything, that you should have like the complete knowledge of what each artist has been doing. So this is something I'm still struggling with, but in general the tactic that now I'm adopting is to try to create some moments of sharing and of co-production with the artist, with the curator, with the local communities, in which there is a real artistic experience, not like a final consumption. And then I will try to like disseminate all this process in different ways, like roundtables, working sessions. Try to let this audience, which could have been outside of the process, and understand together what is going on.
An interesting contradiction, I think, because also as the whole process is very much depending on visibility, that everybody knows where you stand, the outcome can become invisible. And I think on that term, that's also something, as I would say, a tactic of taking away visibility, but to be further thoughtful. To the audience now, I'm sure you have incredible amounts of questions, of remarks, and I would like to immediately open it here to all of you. I'm sure that you're burning to say something. Okay, yes, sir.
Thanks very much for this conversation. I don't want to get into the Istanbul thing. I have my own axe to grind, but and I have another question to you, which I couldn't quite figure out from my own end. How you kind of juxtapose sculpture in action with traffic. To me, like the biggest similarities more or less are the same year, I guess, no? 94, 95, something like that. Because the culture in action is very much embedded in a post-colonial self, first of all, which in the traffic exhibition, especially the French, have no idea about what post-colonial context is, or they never developed the discourse around it, whereas it's very much in the heart of Sculpture in Action project. That's one. Secondly, the way the constituency and audience is defined or is articulated between these two projects are, to me, completely different order. And thirdly, in terms of curatorial conceits, Mary Jane's position is more their enabler. I mean, once she gets the ball rolling, she's more an enabler and manager rather than a kind of overdefined, kind of overdetermined curatorial self. So, which is also a very generous attitude, obviously. I mean, so if you would just unpack that a little bit more.
Well, the reason why I decided to choose these two projects is not because there are many points in common, but because I think that at this point it is necessary to rethink the idea of relationality and of social in the curatorial practice. So I really wanted to show the frictions rather than the similarities. And yes, I do totally agree with you about the completely different approaches that the two curators have. And I think that one of the reasons why also I chose to speak about these two projects is that after 20 years, I think that there has been enough time, to rethink from sort of historical point of view, what, not necessarily the specific projects, but the declination of these words of relationality, which is still there. We still use it, and we still use very similar strategies, but I really felt the urgency to go back to the etymology of this word, of the use of this word in the contemporary art scenario. So basically, this is the main reason. And also, I think that something that I will have to work with a lot, but it's of great interest to me is to try to understand how Mary Jane Jacob is an example of curatorial practice in the field of socially engaged art, but in the US. In Europe, it still seems to me that there are many things that are not clear from this point of view. So I'm not borrowing the model of Mary Jane Jacob and export it in Europe. But I mean, it's a hint. Let's say that it's a way to start thinking about our agencies as curators in this field in Europe now. Especially because there are many things going on in Europe. There are, as I was saying in the paper, different narratives that are overlapping, even if they are totally different. There is the narrative of the crisis, which is very heavy. There is the narrative of the transnational, so European policies that try to push us to have collaborations with between Europe and the Mediterranean. So all these things together are somehow pushing me to rethink what's the agency of curators and how curators can open spaces for, again, for mental resistance towards these main narratives. But I'm not sure if I answered your question.
In an interesting way, what there's a little bit of history. There's a little bit of history which would actually interest you. Is that because of your investment in Italian-Albanian situation? Is that there's a bit of exhibition history and kind of participatory practice history over, even on that particular tangent?
Yeah, definitely. There are many artists. For example, Adrian Paci is the most well-known that are working on this dialogue. But for example, for that project, we chose to avoid every sort of spectacularization of the process. The act of putting this antenna in order to capture the TV signal, it totally happened in the middle of nothing. It was totally integrated in the daily life of that place. So we decided not to launch the news, come and see the antenna. It just happened. It created some movement, some social interaction. It created an accumulation of knowledge in that specific moment, and then it disappeared. So this is how I think we are trying somehow to reshape the idea of engagement also in the public sphere.
Question that follows that last thought that you provided, and it has to do with funding, because I think it's interesting that there's a lot of funding for things that are about engagement and about working with communities, and the way you're describing the curatorial process is actually really in tension with that funding available for that other kind of practice. That it's like two different scenarios, although the two of them are talking about engagement. So I'm curious, because it's really interesting to hear your process, your curatorial thought of trying to avoid some pitfalls and propose a new strategy. And I'm wondering if you're thinking at the same time of how to create a financial architecture that will be able to support that thinking without constraining the curatorial thought and making it into something else.
Well, I have to say that we haven't found that many opportunities, grant opportunities. Also because the way we work, we don't work with big numbers. So even if we speak about social engagement, maybe the process could involve 10 people, and this is not enough. I mean, the evaluation of what we do not fit at all the guidelines of these funding opportunities. So it's tricky because it's the themes are almost the same, but at the same time we cannot provide eventual funders, which most probably could be the EU, with the sort of results that they need. So I didn't answer.
To maintain the resistance, then it's a matter of, at this moment, of the scale of the project.
Yes, yes, yes. It's very small scale. Even if we try to keep a dialogue both with the local scene and the international context, art context, but it's a very small scale project actually. In the moment in which it operates, it involves doesn't involve 100 people for each project. It can be 10. But this is, as you said, the sort of resistance that we are doing.
Any questions? Yes.
I have questions, actually maybe starting with Anna, but could be relevant to everybody. And forgive me because I'm an interloper, I haven't been part of these past 6 days, which sounds so rich. But my question is a practical one, and it's about the parameters of time around the socially engaged or public projects. And I ask partly because I think that when public projects happen within the bounds of an exhibition's run, they can run the risk of instrumentalizing the communities or audiences they work with, and the more successful ones don't always have been ones with real longer-term investments where the authorship really transfers and is activated among the communities that are participating. So it's a question from Anna's presentation, because I wasn't sure how time worked within the projects that you're talking about, but also for the other two presenters too. What are the length of times related to the public projects?
Well, we have been there for, like now is the 3rd year. So each project, yes, is quite short. And we try to make sure that each artist intervention is based on a strong exchange. And it's a moment of mutual learning. But the continuity is given by us, the curatorial team that keep working there since 3 years. So this is also the interesting overlapping that I was mentioning between the artist agency and the curatorial agency. Because anyway, we keep connections with the communities, we are constantly in dialogue with different associations, so it's not really related to the presence of the artist. It's much more related to our curatorial practice.
I don't know, I guess one of my questions about the biennial this year and its withdrawal from the public spaces is around that issue of how that would play out in a space that was removed from the public. You know, you could have projects that were engaging and lasting beyond the biennial, for instance. And it sort of really seems to constrain what could be possible.
I think this comes back to the question that George had for me about temporality, and it's very difficult to find a position as a researcher about a city or a biennial that is in constant flux, and how to assess something when it's constantly changing and there are so many different perspectives of it day to day as new institutions are set up and others close. I think that's all I have to say about time.
2 more questions, yes?
I don't know if there was another one before me. But
okay, who was that?
I think there was. No? Anyway, so my question is actually to Kate. Kate, yeah. I realize that you have done a lot of research prior to coming here about the biennial and the history of the biennial in Istanbul and how it proceeded. And then I had the pleasure of attending the talks with Fulya Erdemci and then separately with Andrea Phillips. And I think it was a privilege that the fact that it was separate talks and they weren't present in each other's. I was wondering what your thoughts. I mean, I know you need time to evaluate, but what were your initial evaluations of prior to coming, doing the reading, and then you were mentioning that Fulya being a Turkish female curating, and then I thought their thoughts were very different and their evaluations were very different. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
It's a really good question, and you're right, I'm still processing all of it. Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult when you've never been to a particular biennial before and you have to rely on the information that you find on websites and in the literature describing that biennial, previous editions of it. I mean, in terms of particularly asking Fulya about what she thought about being Turkish and female and what impact that had, I mean, this was something, you know, in looking at all the previous editions and realising that, you know, most of the previous editions were curated by outsiders to Istanbul was something that I found incredibly interesting. And so naturally it was a kind of first thought to ask her, well, what difference does it make? But it's so much more complex than that. The fact that she was living in Amsterdam for quite some time beforehand as well has, you know, just as much to do with it as the fact that she's Turkish. It's these grey zones that I find incredibly fascinating. These spaces in between what your identity is and where you are situated, and how that affects your ability to respond to something that is quite a local issue. And yeah, the talk by Andrea was completely different in the sense that I think she was very, I mean, both of them were very, very open about, you know, discussing that, which I thought was fantastic. And Andrea's perspective, of course, was always as an outsider coming here. But what was interesting to me was this idea of, well, what is the pull to somewhere else, and particularly with the theme of the Biennale on such a local and contested issue, what's the pull for an outsider? What is it that makes you interested in that kind of topic? And of course, you know, that's so much more complex because they had a prior relationship of working together. So it's, I don't know, I don't think that answers your question very well. I'm sorry for that, but yeah.
Yes. Did you also have a question, sir? Just. Okay, so maybe we'll just start with Monica.
Well, it's kind of following with that same idea, and I was wondering, you asked yourself a lot of questions, and I'm sure you are going to answer them eventually. But this idea of locatedness and the fact that biennials more and more seek to be in touch with the local context. Have you contemplated the paradox of why it is that biennials are hiring international curators to come and address these local
questions instead of sourcing from their own
yes.
body of curators.
And that's something that I'm finding very difficult to trace. A fantastic talk with Vasif at the beginning of our visit here, and one of the questions I asked him was, well, who decides? Who decides the curator? What's that selection process? The answer was very enlightening and a little bit disturbing. I won't go into that, perhaps you can ask him. But I'm very interested in that, and I'm very interested in this idea of, you know, a municipality-funded organisation that decides on, you know, an outside voice to come in and comment on something very local, even if that person may be from here, you know, but is residing elsewhere. So I'm not quite sure how that will play out in my research. I would like to touch on that. Yeah.
Just for history's sake, I mean, first biennial organized, second biennial organized by local woman creator, Pera Matra. Third one by me, fourth Renee, fifth Rosa Martinez, woman, not local. 6 and 7 male, 8 female, 9 male, 10 male, 11 3 females, 12 2 males, 13 females. So it has a pretty good record. Strange enough, it's not intentional, it's not programmatic, but it has a pretty decent record in terms of gender ratio. You know, when I went to graduate school, my professor said one day something which was very oddly kind of disturbing to me, but I find this, I should say this today, at this very moment actually. He would say, you know, I was an art history graduate, blah, blah, blah, and the late Kurt Warnedor, whom I love very much, I love a lot of things about him. He said, don't trust the artist. Which, at that moment, was a kind of a shocking thing to hear, you know, like, don't trust the artist. I would say, don't trust the curator. Because it's all about intentionalities and positions, etc., etc. I mean, we say whatever we say, and especially the topic is so hot, it's so urgent, it's so around us, and etc., etc. Don't get overwhelmed by it. You know, I mean, it's better to look at the stuff, not even talk to us. You know? It's better to see what's going on and how it's going on, etc., etc. Because otherwise you get lost in the drama of the local curator coming from Amsterdam, and you know, just been attacked by radical activist artists, and then there was the resistance, and you know, I mean, I don't think it would be at all helpful to kind of write histories from that perspective. I mean, don't trust me. That's because I mean that I cannot move outside the history in which I'm in. I cannot move outside the web in which I'm embedded. So that's where I speak from, and but it's super subjective.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that the thing in particular that I would try and look at is not so much, you know, from a perspective of blah blah or blah blah, but perhaps to look at this idea of you know, the concept of the curator with universal knowledge, this international curator with universal knowledge, and that's the thing that I find the most interesting.
I'm so sorry, I really forgot what I really want to say, so sorry. You know, we did the first, after doing the first 3D, I thought my only little contribution to the history of the biennial is that I persuaded the foundation not to ever hire a Turkish curator again. Because I mean that was the limit of the pool or the resource, the capacity at that time in the beginning of '90s. You know, there was no way they would be able to hire a person from. And what saved the biennial in the long run, that unlike some others out there, they looked international, and that was in the long term a very correct thing to do. But there's always the pressure at the same time. Oh, this time should it be local or not? But I mean that's the pressure that everybody, I guess, applies on themselves at the advisory board and so on and so forth. But the biennial would never have been the thing it is if it had gone with the local cast of characters time and again.
if that is not the case, I would just, as concluding remark, suggest that in fact, which was already mentioned before, locatedness is not a geographical fact. And I do think that the Global South, with its present very strong agendas and theories, post-colonial theories notably, actually also provide new possibilities of solidarities. And I do think what happens here in Istanbul at the very moment is by no means a singular element. And I think also that connectivity to Egypt, to Tunisia, to whatever, are things which are, I think, interesting to be thought of as both local phenomena and local in the way they are interpreted, but they also talk to a bigger, let's say, capitalist or post-capitalist state we are in. And Achille Mbembe had spoken very beautifully of that, what he considered Europe as a sad continent. And I do think that there are a lot of energies which are on those spaces which are neither here nor there. They are neither in the north nor in the south. They are somewhere negotiating, and I think there great possibilities are. And in that context also, I think we should very, very much revisit some of our notions we have been given and we have been taught as doctrines, and one of the worst is sustainability. I so don't believe in it, and I do think the ideas which were actually brought here time and again, ecosystems, ecologies, suggest of breathing spaces. And I think breathing means that something is coming in, something is going out, and the thing of disappearing, we cannot keep on being nostalgic about that, because they also give way for others. But anyway, not enough philosophing. I would like to apologize on behalf of all us foreigners not to have the intelligence to speak Turkish and be able to interact with you in maybe even more precise ways. But thank you so much for having made the effort to speak in English for us. And Maria, if I just could call upon you as the organizer to sort of make the last gesture of closing this event.
We are going to conclude the session. I could only remember, let's see how to say thank you in Turkish again, which... Teşekkürler. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you again to Saha and Salt for hosting us.